Everything that is happening now has happened before. A pandemic has struck India. There has been panic. There have been heated debates about lockdowns, about masks, about vaccines. The state has been negligent and the state has overreached. Civil society has risen up in protest. All kinds of rumors about the disease have spread through the land and the bodies of the dead have piled up. Except, wait a minute, all this has not only happened before, but it has been much worse. Between 1817 and 1920, India was struck by 3 pandemics, which at one point were upon us at the same time. Cholera, the plague, and influenza killed 40 million people during these 100 years. In fact, 70 million if you count the 30 million killed by cholera in the years when it was merely endemic and not pandemic. In this time, populations have been devastated, villages wiped out, and bodies have piled up on the streets. The state has failed, and the backlash has changed our history. And yet, when we are faced with a modern pandemic today, we have forgotten all these lessons of the past. But these lessons matter. To understand these modern times, to deal with the situation in which we find ourselves today, we need to learn about India's tryst with pandemics.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Chinmay Tumbe, author of Age of Pandemics, a marvelous new book that looks at how the Indian subcontinent was ravaged by 3 pandemics in the century between 1817 and 1920. They took more lives than we could imagine, and they shaped our history, our economy, our politics, and our society in profound ways. Chinmay argues that we need to build a collective memory about this past so that we can avoid its mistakes and apply its lessons. Age of Pandemics is a wonderful book of scholarship and analysis, which is not a surprise to me because Chinmay's previous book, India Moving, a study of migration within India, is in my opinion one of the most underrated books written about India in the last decade. I did an episode on that book with Chinmay about a year and a half ago, and both that book and that episode will be linked from the show notes. I was delighted to have him once again on the show, but before we get to our conversation, let's take a quick commercial break. We often think of ourselves as the masters of the universe, the one species that managed to tame the earth. This is nonsense. If you look at it one way, we are puppets colonized by viruses and bacteria. We should have had occasion to think about this in 2020. And we certainly should learn about our past encounters with these mysterious forces. This episode and Chinmay Tumbe's book is a great way of doing so, and I have one more suggestion for you. Hop on over to thegreatcoursesplus.com, the sponsors of this episode, and check out the superb online course called An Introduction to Infectious Diseases by Barry C. Fox. In 24 fascinating lectures, Fox takes us through our long struggle with infectious diseases. And if you want to learn something more cheery, chances are that you will find it at the Great Courses Plus. They have a fantastic library of online courses from subjects ranging from music, math, cooking, history, political theory, and much else. They also have an app where you can listen to the audio of these courses the same way you listen to podcasts, and it will cost you nothing. You get 1 month of unlimited free access if you use the following URL, thegreatcoursesplus.com/unseen. That's right, unseen. thegreatcoursesplus.com/unseen for 1 month of unlimited free access. Don't procrastinate. Soak up that knowledge. Chinmay, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Hi, thanks for having me over.
You know, the last time we spoke, it was about your wonderful book, India Moving, which I keep recommending to people because I just think it deserves to be more widely read, and more specifically because it gave me so many insights into my own country, so many TIL moments. And that, of course, took sort of a long time in the making. On the other hand, this marvelous book that you have now written has happened in the space of a few months. You know, tell me the story of how that came about.
Yeah, it's just, if you told me in Jan that I would write a book by December on pandemics, I would have laughed. And in a way, I'm still laughing because it's just a series of events which happened this year that, ultimately culminated in the book. But really, the starting point is, of course, that, when I was writing on migration, even my PhD thesis, I was coming across cholera, I was coming across plague, I was coming across influenza. In fact, even my PhD thesis in 2012, I have this map of population growth rate in 1911 to 21. So I clearly knew some of these interesting things about these pandemics. because I'd encountered them before in my research on migration. But obviously, I had not done, I had never written a research paper on pandemics. I had never really followed up on that initial interest. But I had been scraping through material wherever I went. I was at the British Library, many years back doing archival research. And there's a report on cholera in 1867. And I kind of got that photocopied. So I had certain material. And the starting point of this project was really March 11th, 12th, when the WHO declared it to be a pandemic. And I, in fact, actually tweeted a bit, on influenza impact on India, and it got a fair amount of traction. And one of the things I very quickly realized was, first, there's actually no book written on influenza in India, which is the greatest demographic disaster ever in human history, actually. I mean, 20 million people dying in a few months, it's never happened before. So this was, something truly unique. Somebody had to write it. And then, as the book starts off with this dialogue with my son actually asked me, what's this whole thing about pandemics? Were they happening in the past? And I said, yes. And, he pointed out that influenza was also mentioned in the Tintin. And I realized that, there's some ways in which the memory is stored. But overall, unless it's the Black Death of Europe in the 14th century, where a lot of books have been written, or even the influenza, there's a book by John Barry on the influenza. India is one small paragraph in a 500-page book when half the deaths of that pandemic happened in India. So India was really underserved in the current research. And the fact that in all three pandemics, cholera, plague, influenza in this century between roughly 1817 and 1920, India was at the epicenter. Right. And this just really struck me in March that, somebody really has to be writing about this. And then, I quickly realized that I was in a unique position to do it because I had already assembled this massive mortality statistic database as part of my interest in economics and history. And so I started analyzing that database and I could see the trends, when is mortality rising and so on. So that gave me more confidence that, I could do something on this. And then coupled with, the fact that a lot of the databases on this are actually freely available online. So the Wellcome Trust has, all these pictures and reports freely available online. So that kind of reduced the transaction costs of doing research. A typical, project in history would take many, many years. You sit in archives and so on. But I realized that at least some of it was easily doable. So then I think in about April, I kind of said, okay, this is a potential project. Of course, it would not be possible without family support. The amount of hours I've put into writing consecutively meant, I should really thank my wife and son for giving me that space to just go out there. I think I would say 100 days of just literally nonstop work, coupled with then, of course, many more months of post-production and so on. So it's been a crazy year for everyone. It's been a crazy year for me. In the process, also, my lost a friend. So the book is dedicated to a friend who's a librarian of IIM Ahmedabad. And it's really thanks to, again, the library of Ahmedabad, that we could actually get a lot of this material. So it's a combination of amazing teamwork, which kind of got the book. And I really wanted it out in 2020. That would have had a nice ring to it. So finally, the last month, December 2020 is when we could get it out.
Yeah, no, what's crazy about this is that your book is by no means a quickie. In the sense, it's immaculately researched. And what I like to do whenever I read nonfiction is I'll go over to the footnotes whenever I find something interesting and look at where that's from and look at sort of the bibliography. And you just read a bunch of books while doing this, not just books in terms of historical books, books on previous epidemics / pandemics, but even, you've quoted throughout your book from different novels and literary works and all of that very aptly. So I simply have to then ask you about, what are your processes of knowledge management, for example? Like how many books, if I may ask, did you read during this period? How many books do you normally read? How many did you read during this period? And what are your sort of methods or hacks for compressing this kind of data gathering and knowledge gathering and, all of that?
So great question. There's no doubt. I have read more books in 2020 than any year of my life. And I love to read, so this has definitely been a year of massive, massive amount of reading, not just the number of books, but also research articles, papers, and so on. Now, well, the book has like 800 footnotes and it cites over 400 studies. But I should say that, does that mean I have read each and every book cover to cover? That's impossible. That's impossible for anybody to read, say, 300 books in a year. That's just impossible. So a lot of books, of course, I quickly realized what is the really important part of it and really, get that into the book. So, for example, there's a great book called Everyday Technologies, which is about really technology history of India. But there's this amazing part on plague where there's a reference in this book about how the tailors of Singer Manufacturing Company, which was a multinational based in India, they had this particular issue of tailors dying because of the plague in the late 19th century. And I just got that reference. Now, it just so happens that I've read this book in the past, but there are many books in which very quickly, as a researcher, you can go through the index, you're looking for plague, cholera, influenza. These are the three pandemics. And if you get it, you're lucky. Right. So I would also say I've gone through many more books which are not cited just to find out if they mention plague, cholera, or influenza. But in the process, I had to read certain core. The first book, let me tell you, the process. The first book I read was this Cambridge Encyclopedia of Human Diseases, right? Because I had to tell myself, look, I don't know anything about medical science. I am not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I'm looking at this literally from a trained economist who's getting into history. That's my background. So I said I have to be at least, I should not get the science drastically wrong, so I had to read it. So this is a 1,000-page book, which came out in 1993. Obviously, there's no update since then. But this is supposed to be the canonical work on medical history. And so those 1,000 pages gave me like this nice, quick summary of all the major diseases of the world, major medical schools. So that was the starting point. And then some of the canonical works on cholera, canonical works on plague, and unfortunately influenza. Literally nothing has been written on India. So there's really no book on India. Similarly with plague and cholera, David Arnold has a book, so that was useful to start with, and then he's done wonderful work even in the recent days. So then slowly after that, of course, for a writer, you want to tie up the basic academic blocks with literary references, with variety of things, newspaper archives, which are easily accessible, at least from our library. But there are a lot of chance discoveries. So I was, literally one fine day thinking, there are not enough first-person references in what I'm doing right now. It's becoming a drab sort of statistical kind of analysis. And I was just looking at my bookshelf, and there it was, Smriti Chitre, which is this Marathi autobiography by Lakshmi by Tilak, written in the 1930s and translated in English just a few years back by Shanta Gokhale. And there it was. There was a first-person reference about plague. And unknown even to Shanta Gokhale, who translated the book, the disease Man Modi was nothing but this great influenza epidemic of 1918. And it was a eureka moment that, I said, she's talking about influenza 1918, which is the greatest disaster, in a first-person account because that family went through that. So I got these amazing references purely out of chance. So I think the writer's thing is then about putting these things in a nice sort of a story. But the big story is very clear. This was a period where we are told in India is the rise and fall of British rule. And yet what I was finding is in the day-to-day lives of people, they were less scared of the British than infectious disease. Because it's like today. We have concerns with the politics and so on. But the primary concern over here is trying not to get this disease. And that's pretty much how Indians were looking at this. And the numbers were stark. We're saying about 70 million people globally died of these three pandemics, 40 million in India alone. These are numbers greater than the wars fought in this period. More people died in India in the influenza than all of the people who died on the battlefields of World War I. So putting all that together, I thought I had a fair amount of kind of work cut ahead for me. But luckily, access to resources was relatively easy because I live on a university campus. So that's, I think there are various things that cut down transaction costs of doing research. As I said, amazing library team. They got me really rare, even manuscripts from, just talking with other libraries. They have these fantastic interlibrary ties. So clearly, if you're not in a university setting, obviously, I think the transaction costs are much, much higher. But a lot of chance encounter. I was in South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, which is a burial ground, literally few days before the lockdown. A few more days and I would be stuck in Calcutta. And this book would probably never happen. It's just so happened that it came back to Ahmedabad. But South Park Street Cemetery, my economist training, I saw this book at the counter, and that was the registry of all the deaths out there. Now, at that point, I didn't know I was going to write a book on pandemics, but I picked up that book, I bought it, and I got it to a spreadsheet. This is what all economists will do, put it in a spreadsheet. And there it was, because I wanted some evidence that 1817, a lot of people said this was an important year, and the book starts on this year. How do you show that 1817 is, there were a lot of deaths in 1817? One is by saying, people said that something happened in that year. But ideally, you would like to see like a trend line. You would want to have pre-1817 data and then show that, 1817 things jump up. And there it was. I got this digitized, and this was the burial grounds in Calcutta where cholera had struck big time. And it's a flat line before 1817, and it spikes up. So the number of burials recorded in South Park Street Cemetery conforms to what people were saying then, about which years cholera struck very, very nicely, not just for 1817, but, for the next 50 years. So again, a chance encounter, literally a walk through the cemetery, picking up a book, and then that becomes a useful source.
So I'll kind of stick on this subject for just a moment before we get to the book. Once you're doing all of this reading, how do you organize the knowledge that you're taking from there? Like, is there a special software that you use? Many of these, I'm guessing, especially if you're getting them from the library, they'll be like physical books. Is there a software? How do you organize all of this knowledge? How do you manage all of that?
Yeah, I would say I'm quite old-fashioned that way. I know there are, specialized software. I'm sure I can do research more efficiently than what I'm doing right now. I'm old-fashioned in the sense I use a spreadsheet. So I put all my thoughts in a spreadsheet, and I have lines put in bold, which I don't want to miss over, and what I can miss, it's not in bold. But what I definitely do is, like in this project, I kind of try to collect all the basic literature. So what I made a list of about 500 studies, which I said I have to go through. Even if I don't read each of them cover to cover, I should be aware of what they're saying. And so I put those 500 studies, word sheet. So it's a reference sheet. And that's going to be, by the way, next week, there's a supplement to this book, which is going to go online. It's a working paper. And so that will have a list of, all the studies. So I made that first. So I knew what, I was working within. And then, after that, the spreadsheet kind of helps sort your ideas, kind of saying, okay, this is the flow. It was all nebulous. When I started in March, I really didn't know all I knew is that there are going to be 3 chapters, core chapters of the book, which is, cholera, plague, and influenza. And then maybe an introductory chapter and a concluding chapter kind of reflecting on COVID-19. But then beyond that, how do you write on cholera? Because cholera is almost a 100-year pandemic. So it's really pick and choose. You can't talk about each and every year. You can't talk about each and every country. So you really have to select. And so my process of selection then is, like in the book on migration, is demographic. That is, where did it have the largest impact? So obviously India had the largest impact and India gets covered the most. But in cholera, I devote some time to Egypt, because Egypt had the largest, like 10% of its population was wiped out. So as a percentage of population, Egypt was the most affected. So, it affected US, it affected Mexico. So I try to then cover those regions which are most affected. And I think that's the pattern in all the chapters. That is, the regions most affected by the pandemics. So if you talk of plague, not just Bombay. Most of plague literature in Bombay on India is Bombay City. And this book, probably the first time, it's really expanding that thing because Bombay City was a really small part of India's plague encounter. The bulk of it was the Bombay Presidency, Punjab, UP, outside Bombay. The bulk of it was rural India. People think of plague as being a Bombay incident. The bulk of it was actually rural India. So that's the sort of sorting process to try and get the big picture. Where is it actually affected? And then trying to get literature which has looked at that. And where it's not been written, then to actually dig up sources, go to newspaper archives and, variety of other things to kind of old reports, vaccination records, variety of things. And along the way, you discover a lot, So some of it has been done by medical historians. So I looked at that literature very closely. But beyond that, to your question about efficient management of information, I don't think I'm terribly efficient, but there is some method, I think, in this, research process.
Fascinating. Let's move on to the book now. And before we start talking about pandemics per se, there was a broader question which I thought I should ask at the start because it really intrigued me and struck me, how we normalize all the progress that we make in terms of technology or standards of living or whatever. And I was, struck by when you wrote the following words about mass mortality, where you wrote, quote, "Once upon a time, we barely lived before we died. We would celebrate on average only 25 birthdays in our lifetimes, and we rarely grew old enough to see our grandchildren. Mass mortality through war, famine, natural disasters, and epidemics was a way of life. We began to live longer only when we fought fewer wars, understood how to fight famines, grew resilient to natural disasters, and learned how to control the spread of disease." Stop quote. And at different points in the book, when you talk about, specific pandemics or even diseases, we see how you could not take life for granted. For example, at one point when you're writing about smallpox, you write, quote, "There's an old saying in India, common in the 19th century, that children were not counted as permanent members of the family until they had encountered smallpox once and survived." Stop quote. And then, later when you're sort of talking about another pandemic, you quote David Gilmour in the British in India saying, quote, "One visitor reported that he had twice lunched with men whose burials he had been invited to attend before supper the same day. When an epidemic arrived at a station, people began measuring their lives in hours. They went to the club each evening apprehensive to know who was missing from the night before. Death was so familiar to the British in India, so quick and so frequent, that there hardly seemed room for prolonged grief. If an officer died on campaign, his belongings were auctioned as soon as the funeral was over. Horses, clothes, revolver, even his cooking pot and his water bottle. Stop quote. And it kind of struck me that back in the day, and pandemics weren't obviously the only threat to life, it was almost a fact of life that when you are young itself, your friends are going to start dying on you. You have such huge amounts of people, and we are possibly one of the few generations, over the last few decades that we don't have to kind of deal with this. The mortality rate, the average lifespan used to be 25 a few decades ago, and now it's 70, and we can take certain things for granted. So in your reading of history, it seems to me that this then hangs over everything. It hangs over everything that people do, the way they live their lives, the way they behave. So, what are your sort of thoughts on this as a historian kind of coming across this? Because, this layer of sort of likely mortality where, you can't take long life for granted as we all do, that simply isn't there for most of human history.
Before 1920, this book ends in 1920 because that's the transition point when you look at India's death data. India's death rate starts falling only after 1920. But before 1920 in India, and of course before certain periods, say 1850s in Britain and so on, death rates, we're talking of something like 50 per 1,000, 5% of the population dying every year. Now, those are very, very high numbers. That's about 10 times higher than what we are living with today, right? And the worst part of that death rate is infant mortality, right? So it's also the fact that most people who died actually in a year were actually small kids, which is also a great achievement of the last 100 years of getting, those rates down. So, for example, when I walked around this South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, you see these tombs, right? And when you walk past them, you think, okay, these are the guys who've died and so on. When you look at the data, 20% of those deaths were actually kids. So they're actually buried out there, but you don't really think when you walk in a cemetery of kids who died in such large numbers. So that's pretty much human history. There are theories which say, there's some bad periods and so on, but all the evidence is pointing out that there's no real epoch in human history where people live for 100 years and so on. Maybe, of course, you have few individuals, who live for a long time. Like in the age of pandemics, the two people who, live for nearly 100 years, coinciding with the period I'm mentioning, is Dadabhai Nauroji. Dinyar Patel has a nice book on this. But he survives the entire age of pandemics. It's perfectly, his life is just about that. He dies, I think, a year or two before influenza. So, but almost 90 plus years in that period. The other one is Florence Nightingale. She also lives for almost 100 years. So these are outliers. But the average person, cannot expect to live more than 25 years in India. So there's even this concept of a grandparent, obviously people are marrying young, so you're becoming potentially grandparents at the age of 40 or 50, but you don't live that long. So it's this whole notion that, today we can see our grandparents and so on. It's a very modern day concept. Just the mortality was so high. And why was it so high? Of course, like I mentioned, there's war, there are these other things, but fundamentally epidemics, right? And so the big killers of history is malaria. Okay, so in India, at least, more people have died from malaria than probably anything else. But then you had these chance epidemics like cholera or, plague and influenza, which we call as pandemics. But then variety of other things, diarrhea, then tuberculosis, a big killer. And ultimately, all of this is linked with nutrition. The healthier we are, even if there was plague, you could survive it to a certain extent. So at the base of mortality is how well are you eating food, as simple as that. And in a world where you had famines, where your whole economy was completely rain-fed or, rain-dependent, especially in India, a slight sort of, bad rainfall meant people would start starving. And even if you're not going to die out of complete starvation, the disease would act upon undernutrition. And that has huge salience today, because we're saying that, this is the year where the average Indian has actually got poorer. Nutrition, even the latest data suggests kind of, not so great. What it means is that if you don't get your basic nutrition levels up, there's always going to be this impact of infectious disease is going to be that much more. And that is why it was so stark, before 1920. So after 1920, it improved precisely because nutrition kind of improved a little bit, but also because the better control of, certain diseases which increase. And that's, I would say, the great achievement of the last 100 years is precisely this, what Angus Deaton calls the great escape, this rise in well-being, really life expectancy, the fact that people can live, for almost 70 years now in India, the life expectancy at birth, compared to it being 25 and falling, for some years in the early 20th century, is the remarkable achievement of modern science.
And is it fair to say that, the 19th century, in a sense, was the period that you write of, in fact, specifically 1817 to 1920, almost as such, is like if you were pandemics personified, you would think that this is an optimal time for you to exist. Because on the one hand, you suddenly have globalization and travel everywhere, so all of these things can spread. And on the other hand, modern medicine hasn't yet caught up with all of this. And it is in that sweet spot where these things, they're spreading faster than ever, but science hasn't figured out what is causing them, leave alone how to cure them.
Absolutely. Like, think about the railways, so much fascination with the railways, and that obviously any transport. I mean, the one link between my first book and the second book is that, you cannot have a pandemic without some migration. I mean, that's the link between pandemics and migration. And there's no doubt that obviously some transport would have, carried out, these infectious diseases. Though having said that, even some of these diseases also travel just by, when people are walking. So it's not that you had to have modern transport to have a pandemic in the first place. But let's take railways. People are fascinated by the railways, but at the same time, over time, as these diseases intensified, there was no doubt that, there was some sort of negative fallout because of the railways in spreading diseases. So you're absolutely right. This globalization, all the things which are celebrated in the 19th century, right? I mean, this is the birth of the modern world. One of the reasons this book, I mentioned this in the first chapter, you have on the one hand, say, Christopher Bailey's The Birth of the Modern World. This is a grand project of, the rise of the modern world between 1789, the French Revolution, and 1914, First World War. Then you have the Eric Hobsbawm series, Age of Empire, Age of Capital, and, all these grandstanding books. And yet both these series don't, or because they're Eurocentric, most of that stuff comes from a European view, epidemics and pandemics are really not part of that story. Right. And that's one of the things. If you wrote European history of the 14th century, you would have to talk about the plague, the Black Death. And so this is where actually this book comes in, because it's pitched at this idea that this was an age of pandemics. Pandemics affect, of course, most parts of the world, but it had a disproportionate impact on Asia, and within Asia, a disproportionate impact on India. And that is why this overall century of progress, seen from, say, Western prism, America is surging ahead. They go up from a population of something like 5 to 10 million to 100 million by the end of this time period. Europe is surging ahead. And typically the Indian view is, colonialism kind of dented India's prospects and so on. Actually, what this book is arguing is that pandemics was also a constraining factor. The fact that we could not do business in the first place as much as what the West could do was because we had these pandemics in the first place. So absolutely right. This is an interesting period of history, because on the one hand, there's this dramatic revolution, what we call is the first and second industrial revolution. And yet, on the other hand, you have this massive spread of diseases. And the West is continuously concerned. When you see what they're talking about, cholera, plague, the memory for them is the Black Death. It's a memory which stays on for 5 centuries or 6 centuries. And they don't want that to happen, because the Black Death, wiped out 1/3 of Europe by most estimates, which is a huge percentage, 1/3 of a big region as Europe dying out. And so while the Black Death had registered in the European consciousness, somehow this period, 1817 to 1920, it's kind of completely escaped memory. It's not really been recorded well in our history. And that's one of the reasons why the book was written.
One of the things that struck me, and I had no idea that, that it would be the case to this extent, that pandemics actually shaped our history. Like, as we'll go on to discuss in detail, each of the 3 pandemics that you talked about obviously changed economics and society, but also had a massive impact on politics, especially the plague. We keep reading about the battle between the extremists and the moderates in the Congress, but it was, the plague had a big part in that coming about, which was quite surprising to me. And you also kind of point out how during this period, which is sometimes called the Great Divergence, because this is where Asia's share of world GDP falls from like 50% to 20%. And what you point out is that during this time, mainly because of these pandemics, Asia's population, share of the world population, also fell from 65 to 50. Which obviously, had a role in that fall in GDP as well, and is a major part. And yet you're right, whatever histories I have read of these times and these periods, and especially of India, historians will hardly mention all of this. It's almost like in our everyday lives, we kind of take a disease for Granted, like I just recorded an episode yesterday, which will actually release after yours, in which my guest pointed out that every day America is losing as many people to COVID-19 as they lost during 9/11. And yet one is so incredibly visible and the other is, it gets normalized very fast, and it is not one big event which makes for great television. So it kind of just gets lost. Early in the book, you point out about, your two core arguments during the book, and you've actually elaborated on them in the last few minutes. And one is that, you want to place these pandemics in the global historiography, as you put it. For a layperson like me, what do you mean by global historiography? Like, is what you're saying that, the historical narratives that have emerged of the grand themes that shape society have to perforce to speak about these pandemics? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So historiography is used by historians. It's another way of saying the narrative, right? So, for example, what is the most important thing that we remember of, say, the 1700s of India, right? And it's about this tussle between the Mughals and this disintegration. So that's the historiography. Mughal decline, East India Company ascent, and the Marathas, right? This is probably the defining historiography of this period. Now, if somebody comes and tells you that, look, this is happening, yes, but there's something else. There were actually, hypothetically, 5 major earthquakes which hit the 1700s, which actually nobody's talked about right now. And it's actually those earthquakes which tilted the balance of power between these 3 things. That's the kind of stuff, I think, what this book is doing. That is, there is certain things which actually happen. I'm not inventing these diseases. They happen. All these people died, unfortunately, in large numbers. Yet the dominant narrative of the 19th century, right, in the West is one of ascendancy, right? It is one of empire building. So imperialism as one ism, nationalism, another one, right? Globalization. This is a period, especially from the 1850s onwards, massive trade to GDP ratios start rising. City building, urbanization, right? So this is the historiography. So when we talk of global history, of course, this is not happening all around the world, but this is happening in the West, right? And I would say the major historiography of the 19th century is imperialism, right? Because this is a time when empires really grow. And by the late 19th century, even Africa is almost completely colonized after this, Berlin Conference and so on. So in this whole milieu, if you have to look at, especially India, let's start with India, the historiography is one of British ascendancy, right? So 19th century as a world of British ascendancy. And what I'm arguing is actually that the sort of an important event running through this thing is pandemics. Now, it is true that they did not actually use the word pandemics in the 19th century. The word pandemic out of these 3 diseases really applies to influenza. So if you see the Indian government reports, the pandemic word comes for influenza. Plague people are using it, but not so much. So the operative word is epidemics, right? But one way of actually seeing the 19th century, the historiography, is actually that people are really scared. Of course, they're scared of each other, fighting wars and so on, but they're really scared of diseases and new diseases which they have no clue about. So one way of saying is, and why this particular period? I'm trying to make this argument in this book. You can say death rates were always high before 1920. One of the things I'm pointing out is that actually death rates started increasing. Even from those high death rates, they started actually increasing towards the late 19th century. And that, a lot of political events actually were shaped. I mean, much of the book also talks about, important political events which were shaped by these pandemics itself. So what I want to do in this book is to give a more central role for pandemics in global history. It's true that they did not, these pandemics did not kill too many people in Europe, in North America, but it killed a lot of people in Asia, and it killed a lot of people in India. So there is really, even if you think of World War I, it had such few casualties outside of Europe, yet we call it World War I. There's this word attached to it called world. So that's something similar to what I want to do out here, that the fear of this pandemic was there throughout the world. The Americans were concerned about what they call as Indian cholera, just as today they call it the Chinese virus. And so around the world, India was also not known just for the British rule, but as a source of diseases, like how we look at China today. Right? And so this kind of also looks at global history in new light. That is, different parts of the world. So it also impacted geopolitics. That is, how countries were perceiving each other. One part of that story was actually epidemics. So that's what I mean by historiography. What is the narrative? And the standard narrative right now is imperialism, nationalism, globalization. And what I want to argue is that epidemics was also there in this picture. and especially these three pandemics of cholera, plague, and influenza, which definitely affected India a lot. I do have my subtitle of the book has the word "world" in it. Yet any reader who reads this book is going to realize that most of this book is about India. But I do that because most of the deaths were in India. But it's a fact that it did touch upon many parts of the world, from Russia, from Egypt, to even Brazil, where some part of the population was wiped out. And there's a book, Love in the Time of Cholera. Marquez would not have written that book if cholera was not such a defining period, and that cholera emerged from India in at least some form or the other. So that's the whole idea of putting pandemics in 19th and early 20th century, what historians call as historiography.
And your other core focus, which you talk about, is also the building of collective memory, as you put it, in the sense that you argued that, quote, the age of pandemics has been forgotten in the country most affected by it, India, and there is value in remembering it as a major event, just as the Black Death plague pandemic of the 14th century is registered in European consciousness to this day. Stop quote. And, at another point where you're talking about the historical context of such epidemics, you speak about how in the Arthashastra, Kautilya writes about, the four great threats to life, which are war, natural disasters, famines, and epidemics. And yet epidemics is like fourth in his list of priority, and it's not taken so seriously. Why do you think that is? Why do we forget, 20 million people dying, and that too when it was 6.4% of the India's population then, as you point out, is a big deal. So, why do we tend to forget? Is it because there are individual lives and individual stories, and there's like no kind of mass representation or a grand narrative of that sort?
Yeah, I think, how is any memory preserved? One is storytelling. I mean, why is it that we, still narrate the Mahabharata and Ramayana? It's from generation to generation that memory is kept alive. Nobody's telling us, narratives of plague and cholera as bedtime stories any longer. One is, of course, that it's negative. It's about death. So you want to forget it, right? So that's one attribute of why we don't want to hold on to negative memories, and we want to hold on to more such positive memories. Two, there is no identifiable enemy, as with, say, a war, right? So in a war, or like, look at influenza. April 1919, you had the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, right? That has been memorialized. There's a whole thing attached with it, right? I mean, if you go there today, there's a particular monument. You have these 100-year anniversary events. Nobody was commemorating 100 years of influenza, which killed 20 million Indians. But for Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, it killed a few hundred Indians. But the memory is so much stronger. Why? There's a clear enemy, right? It was the British in that case. With influenza, H1N1A is not really an enemy the public is going to sort of take it. So clearly identify enemies. I'll also point out, compared to wars or natural disasters, right, which affect both capital and labor. That is, it not only kills people, it kills the actual building, and it destroys buildings, it destroys monuments. So in historical recording as well, people noted down, the destruction of Rome, the destruction of Delhi, for example. Now with an epidemic, the physical stock of the city doesn't fall. It's just people kind of withering away in that. It could be the case that the epidemic sparks a revolution and then there's mayhem in that. But otherwise, a pure epidemic just takes labor. It doesn't affect capital. And that means in historical recording, it's not glamorous enough. It's not spectacular. And so that's why historians often have failed to actually systematically document these epidemics. So I think that's one of the reasons. Inadequate memorialization. So I point out, like, if you want to know something about plague and so on, if you look closely enough, there might be some markers, like the Haffkine Institute in Bombay, is one memory, because Haffkine was this great, scientist who was associated with both cholera and plague in India. So there's an institute in his honor. But nobody would associate Haffkine with pandemics and so on today. There's a statue in South Bombay of, Vigas, who was the first guy who spotted plague in Bombay. There's a statue, there's a statue. But nobody's really thinking of that statue outside, I think, Metro Cinema as, a memory of the plague back then. And so one of the things that might be, useful is, it's an open question whether we need to have museums on these epidemics or something like that. But definitely it has to be taught. I feel it has to be taught in our history curriculums, in the sense, and especially in medical schools. What I'm really amazed is that this is not being taught in medical schools, right? So, okay, there's a straw man argument that, just because, we say that, this is not taught to us in history. I have my sympathies with people who write history textbooks because, simply put, we cannot put everything in the textbook. Some things have to be left out. So, okay, you don't want to put this history in classical textbooks, that's fine. But medical students, they have to be exposed to this idea that India went through this massive, episode once. And it should definitely inspire them to not only research the past, but also use some of those lessons, for today. So memory is important. And that's what the book is trying to push, that we need to build collective memory, not only of our past, major pandemics, and that can happen in multiple ways. For example, so many health officials in the last 40 years, have devoted their lives to eradicating polio, for example, before that smallpox. They should write their autobiographies, or they should write their memoirs, because that would be of tremendous, use for public health people going forward as to how did we manage to eradicate polio. That was such a great success story. So there need to be books written on that, for example. So if not movies, and that's expecting too much, or even like a day of the year to remember, contributions of nurses, doctors, police people, mortuary workers, and so on. I think just basic introduction of some of these themes in curricula will help, and that's the grand hope of this book, that some of this gets picked up in history textbooks. If not the main class 10 history textbook, at least medical school textbook, or at least be taught as a course in medical schools, that this is, an important aspect of India. Because I can tell you, in Europe, kids grow up knowing what is the Black Death. Black Death is now an interesting event in general history, right? And I think this period demands such attention, because for us, this period is just about British rule, and I think there's something beyond British rule, which in fact took many more lives than British rule themselves did.
Yeah, and one of the things that kind of again struck me about your book is that what we sort of have a vague idea of how the Black Death and how plagues shaped European history in a sense. The three pandemics of these 100 years did a similar thing to India. For example, in Europe, you talk about the Black Death. Quote, is said to have had consequences that are open to debate, such as laying the foundation for the rise of Europe, the Renaissance movement, the Protestant Reformation, and even accelerating anti-Semitism. Stop quote. And later you talk about all the different consequences at that time, like inequality, like in Northern Europe, more women went into the workforce. And of course, anti-Semitism continued rising because Jews were blamed for the pandemic in quote, Aragon, Provence, Catalonia, Switzerland, Rhineland, and southern Germany. So you have these major sort of trends happening, and the pandemic played a part in that. Was it kind of a surprise to you to realize the extent of the role that pandemic played in history? Like, at one point in your book, you write about how while researching your previous book, you put together this map. Tell me a little bit about that map, and, you point to it as a sort of a moment of revelation. Was there kind of more to it than that? And did some of it perhaps come after you had started work on the book?
Yeah, no, that map that you're referring to, it's a simple district level map of India, which shows population growth rates between 1911 and 1921. So on this particular map, when I drew this population growth rate map, it was really stark because most of India actually registered negative growth rate. So it wasn't like one region pulling down the overall population growth rate. Most of India, that's one decade. I plotted these maps from 1901 to now, every decade. So there were about 10 or 11 maps. And they were all positive growth rates. And this one decade, the population of India fell, right? And there's no doubt as to why that happened. It was the influence of 1918. And when I looked at that map, I said, how is it that there's no book on this? This was back then, in 2012. And out of interest, I read there's one or two research papers. Since then, Siddharth Chandra, is a health economist. He's done some work, interesting work on it. But you can count, it's in single digits, the amount of research done on influenza in India. And it was a big mystery. But I didn't follow it up back then because I got more interested in migration. And that's what I worked on for most part of the last decade. And that kind of map really came back when I was in looking at these mortality statistics in March. I literally went back to the map and kind of started exploring. In fact, one of the things which is coming out with the book, as I mentioned, is the supplement. And the supplement has, so how can I say that India lost 20 million people in influenza? In fact, this is now my estimate based on a certain method which I'm using to calculate, influenza losses. So that's going to come out in a supplement in the coming week. And what I do out there is look, again, at this district level data and kind of estimate the population shortfall. So there are a lot of revelatory moments. And this idea that, pandemics, like you mentioned, the Black Death, they can have consequences. So throughout this book, I was trying to understand, no, influenza happened, 20 million people die. There must be some consequences. And at least one debate, interestingly, took place by two great economists, Theodore Schultz and Amartya Sen. And this was in 1967. And they had a debate. This was, both of them eventually won Nobel Prizes, but they actually had a debate on the impact of influenza on India. They had this debate on, is there surplus labor in Indian agriculture or not? So the idea being, if so many people die out, can agricultural productivity still hold? And so it's a very interesting debate that they had back then. There's some now research on influenza and its impact, but throughout the book, there's some which I definitely believe had a massive impact. We can talk about that, labor movements and so on. But there's some also which I call as speculative, as of now in the realm of speculation, as to what was the impact, what are the consequences of this pandemic, going forward. And one of them, which I'm very excited about, and I hope to do more research on, is that it really changes India's urban trajectory. These pandemics have a disproportionate impact on cities in North India, and we know for a fact that what were some of the largest cities of India in in the early 20th century were Lucknow, Allahabad, and so on, and they are nowhere on India's urban landscape today. So, a potential reason for this relative decline of some dynamic cities of the early 20th century was actually pandemics. So that's one of the sort of just like people say Renaissance is because of Black Death. These are big questions, big sort of grand theories, but interesting hypotheses. I don't think anybody's really got the data right now to prove them.
Yeah, and I guess there are never like absolute answers like, yes, this caused the Renaissance. I mean, everything is multifactorial, and this stuff kind of plays into all of that. Let's kind of now, begin with the narrative of the book, and let's talk about cholera. But before we talk about cholera, give me a context of what 1817 is like. Give me a context of the time. Like, we know that the East India Company rules less than a third of the landmass of the subcontinent. Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras are your key sites of commerce, as you point out. Your publishers, HarperCollins, are formed in that year, effectively. Give me a sort of a context of what is the world like? Are people traveling? What is trade like? What are the kind of lives people live? So we can then sort of look at the ground on which, everything begins.
Sure. The first thing to note is that there's no railways, right? So that's a big part which happens post 1825 when it really comes to the UK. So this is a world with no railways where, like the earlier 2000 years, the fastest way to get across the subcontinent is the speed of the horse. Or you could, go down the Ganga in terms of waterborne navigation, which is still highly prevalent. This is a world where movement and migration is happening a bit, but movement, a lot of it is happening for pilgrimages. And these are large-scale pilgrimages, people going in large groups across the subcontinent, and which are the major pilgrimage centers? They continue to be the major ones today, whether it's Tirupati in the south or Haridwar in the north, and different places, and Mecca. So many people from India actually making this journey to Mecca, even in 1817. There were around 1 billion human beings in 1817. So today the population is 7 times more than that, and about 60% of that was in India and China. So about 400 million in China and more than 200 million in India. And the population of US in 1817 was about the size of Calcutta today, right? So it's literally nothing in 1817. Everything, I mean, you think of American history, it really starts off in terms of some demography by the late 19th century when there's this mass transatlantic migration. But before that, it's a really tiny sort of republic. We have the slave trade still on in some pockets, but there's growing pressure to quash the slave trade. In India, the East India Company is on the rise, but it's only in 1818, so 1817, they've still not managed to defeat the Marathas. So that is also in balance of, it's tentatively sort of poised. But the East India Company does operate through these 3 ports of, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, which are doing fairly well. And the Ottoman Empire is there, but it's not doing, too well. There's a guy called Muhammad Ali Pasha who's rising up in Egypt. There's the Saud dynasty in Arabia. There's the Qing dynasty in China. They've not yet fought the Opium War. So China is actually still a proud imperial sort of rulers in that time. There's the Qajar dynasty in Persia. And as you pointed out, Harper Collins, or Harper Brothers as they were called, the publisher of this book, also started in 1817. Just a coincidence out there. So this is really the background. Yeah.
So it's a book on pandemics arising out of what happened in the pandemic year, essentially. And, cholera is not something new. You've pointed out in your book about how it had, in fact, been in what we today call India, even as, long before this in 1543, where, it was there in Portuguese ruled Goa, where they had a rule that, okay, every time somebody dies, we shall have a ringing of the bells. And then so many people started dying that it became a cacophony, and they kind of had to put an end to it. And you've spoken about how in 1757, Ahmad Shah Durrani's army was affected by it. In 1783, 20,000 people died in Haridwar and all of that. Tell me a little bit about cholera. Like, what is cholera? What was known about it at the time? What sort of, happens when one gets cholera? How fast does it spread? All of these things.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, what is cholera? The best way to understand that is firstly in terms of symptoms. So if you get cholera, what happens to you? So like with almost any illness, there's some amount of headache. Okay, you start feeling uneasy. But the classic symptom of cholera is what we would call as loose motions, or, basically watery stools, but classically rice water stools. This is the classic description, clinical description of cholera. Dehydration, that's what's happening with cholera. That is, you're losing a lot of fluids from your body, especially through bowel movement. And that's one of the things about cholera, because it really shocked societies wherever it appeared, because literally you have to go to the toilet. I mean, that's what we are talking about in this disease. Now, are there references to cholera before 1817? Absolutely. So it's not something which is completely new in 1817. Historians have pointed out that even in Ayurvedic traditions, people call this particular thing called Vishuchika as the closest equivalent to cholera. Note another sort of disease is diarrhea. I mean, we use the word diarrhea today. Today, hardly anyone talks about cholera. But there are certain differences. So both of them have similar symptoms. But cholera was far more deadlier. And often patients would also turn blue because of massive dehydration. So, turning blue was also part of the sort of folklore around the disease. And case fatality rates were more than 50%. And this is a nice number to know because it was kind of observed in different settings. So what does that mean for the lay reader right now is that out of 100 people who get the disease, about more than 50 would die. Right? So that is what we are calling as case fatality. So in COVID-19 today, we are saying it's about 1 to 2%. Right? But it's much more virulent than cholera. But cholera's case fatality rate at that time was much more than 50%. And there are references. So the words for cholera before ranged from Morikshi, which was used in Goa. Like I said, Vishuchika is the closest equivalent in Ayurvedic tradition, and Haiza. Right? So Haiza is like Unani practice, So in the Arabic world, as well as, Muslim practitioners, health practitioners in India, Haiza was the form. So for example, if you read this book by Munshi Premchand, called Eidgah, the father of that kid, Hamid, it's a very famous story, dies of Haiza. Right? So Haiza is what is known out there. In fact, that chapter starts with this particular quote by an Hakim, Sayyid Amaldar Hussain, who says, बहुत बड़े डॉक्टर मियाँ हैजा की सूरत देखते हैं तो उनकी रूह कांप उठती है. Right? And that tells you the kind of, if that doctors are scared to kind of treat patients with this because nobody really knows how to treat. So the mystery of cholera is really the fact that you couldn't treat it. I think that's the mystery about any disease, that it's so hard to treat it. And by the 1700s, the first English references to cholera come about. So you can see the word cholera, and it's called cholera morbus for some reason in British medical circles. And that's really what sticks on. And so in 1817, when it kind of, breaks out, it's clear to medical practitioners in India that this is cholera. But what takes them completely off guard is its virulence. So, so the same diseases, it's been recorded in pilgrimage sites. It's been recorded as, devastating Haridwar in the 1780s. So stuff happening before 1817. Yet in 1817, when it strikes, it goes across the subcontinent very fast. And that's why 1817 is different. So the most accepted reason for why 1817 and why not earlier is that there's some sort of a mutation in the strain of cholera. We now know cholera is caused by bacteria. Right? So different bacteria and in a virus and so on. So it's a bacteria which was we're talking more than a century later, called as cholera vibrio. So today, I've mentioned the symptoms of cholera, and cholera vibrio is the sort of agent. But what happens from 1817 for almost 100 years is a really fascinating story of people trying to get to grips with this disease. And the whole debate on its transmission. How is it spreading? Today, at least we're lucky to know some elements of transmission. Though during the year, we moved from being obsessed about surface transmission. Now people say, there's not so much surface transmission, it's more of airborne. But you saw these debates this year. Back then, the fundamental across medical schools in the world, the idea was that, bad air or impure air, what the British would call as miasma, was the reason for every disease. Forget just cholera. And so cholera is an environmental problem. That is, if you have filth, if you have dirt, you will get cholera. That was the causal sort of relationship in 1817. So that's the sort of background. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And just the way people talk of super spreaders today, and, we were quick to blame the Tablighi Jamaat a few months back. The same shit was happening back then. Like you point out about how at one point you say, quote, Puri and many other pilgrimage sites were perceived by Europeans in the 19th century in the way many see Chinese wet markets or meat in 2020. That is, as places that generate pandemics, stop quote. And you speak about how both Hindu and Muslim pilgrimages were blamed for it. There was even an outbreak in Mecca where many people died. And in 1866, the International Sanitary Conference in Constantinople, as it was then, blamed Puri and Mecca. But I want to kind of go back to this question of trying to figure out what causes it. Like, one thing you point out is that really it's only by the middle of the 20th century that oral rehydration therapy comes about and people kind of figure out what to do about cholera, and it isn't such a big deal. But back then you have this sort of atmosphere of complete ignorance and all kinds of crazy theories. Like at one point you describe this one incident in Russia where, quote, a few villagers abducted two doctors on duty who espoused quarantine, tied them to cholera corpses and placed them in a pit. Their survival would be proof against contagion. In that particular case, they did survive and were eventually pulled out of the pit. Stop quote, which is fascinating. The other thing that strikes me is that medicine based on science at that time is at such a primitive stage that alternative medicines are thriving. Like you write at one point, quote, the native physicians, Vaids and Hakims did command respect and were enlisted by the British in relief efforts. The cures offered could be a mixture of various medical traditions. The Vaids prescribed black pepper, ginger, cloves, and that most beloved Indian ingredient, hing, or asafoetida, however you pronounce that. In Madras in South India, physicians practicing Ayurveda, Unani, and Siddha, native to the region, assisted the government. And where the cure seemed to be effective, it won the appreciation of the royals, of the locals, irrespective of who the ruling class was, the British or the local royals. Stop quote. And it strikes me that, medicine back in the day is so primitive. For various diseases, you'd have bloodletting as an option and all of that. Hospitals would not yet be sanitized, so you could actually die because you went to a hospital. That, that is why people would believe in some of these alternative systems. Like, the explanation that I give whenever I talk about, why so many people believe in something like homeopathy, for example, is one, of course, we all know about the placebo effect. But there's also reversion to the mean that, some diseases you'll just automatically get better over time. And if you take whatever medicine you think is medicine, at the peak of that, you will obviously ascribe causation and say, oh, no, this cured me. And all of that. So what's kind of the medical landscape like? Because, today we think of, okay, there is science and, there is proper kind of medicine and we have a great understanding into all of these. But at that time, everything is kind of faith-based depending on whatever you think that works, because nobody really knows anything, right? What was that like?
Absolutely. I mean, also this notion of Western superiority in medicine, right? If at all it was, in fact, what I pointed out in this book is like, for at least these pandemics, it really didn't matter that much. Maybe cholera in the late 19th century, but for plague, they figured it out very late after the pandemic, influenza after the pandemic. So it really didn't help during the pandemic. But in the early 19th century, they were all the same. I mean, there was really no advantage that Western medicine gave in, surviving cholera vis-a-vis Ayurveda, given vis-a-vis Unani, vis-a-vis Siddha, which is in South India. So, as you said, completely faith-based. Does that mean, it's completely useless? Against cholera, it's hard to say. But against basic diseases, I'm pretty sure that some of these things that they would have been offering must have worked. Obviously, there's a credibility criteria. And these doctors would have gained reputation over time only, of course, if things worked. Right? But, this is a world where even these doctors living on side by side with massive superstitions, and you have these witches, you have these sorcerers, you have all kinds of people in especially rural India, but also urban India, who command huge respect. So, of course, goddesses and gods, so in Indian history, Sitala is this classic goddess in Eastern India for smallpox. But very quickly for cholera, across the 1700s and early 1800s, this Ola Bibi came into prominence. And it's really fascinating. So in 1817 and the years following that, Ola Bibi's kind of stock went up much more than Shitala, and so different temples had to kind of woo, in fact, their own patrons, saying that no, our God can, help you out better. So it's interesting how religion was, of course, very closely intertwined, with healing practices. Also, I point out in cholera, this is jumping 100 years later, but Christian conversion, for example, right? So using epidemics as a pretext for missionary movement, saying that look, our science is better. Actually, it wasn't better for a long period, but the claim that our science is better. So if you join our religion, you get some benefits out of it. So this is open game, and health being a day-to-day matter, right? It must have been such an important thing in guiding people's decisions, whether to convert a religion. If somebody's going to say that, I can cure you, it is the most powerful kind of advice, anybody can potentially take. Even in India today, a lot of the spiritual guru market thrives on healing powers, right? And so it's a very closely attached notion. So the medical landscape in 1870s, as you rightly pointed, very primitive, right? There are no clear advantages of any system. And on cholera, as you said, pretty much everyone is clueless. In fact, some of these things that they were doing, like bloodletting, this was a British practice. It was completely opposite of what anybody should be doing. The analogy I use in the book is like, contracting money supply in a recession. This is pretty much what they were doing. That is literally, what you need is actually some amount of fluids in your body. And so taking out even some of that was really a crazy idea. In one of the practices, they would put leeches on the anus to suck out the blood. Really crazy practices which emerged in the 1820s and 1830s. And all of this on the pretext that cholera was somehow coming from the air, from environment, and so on. And so it's really John Snow who's the hero in this whole fight against cholera, who in 1840s and 1850s figures out that, look, hey, this is not about air, this is about water. And that's the big discovery on cholera, that cholera is a waterborne disease. And yet, even though John Snow kind of proves it in the 1850s, he's not very famous in his lifetime. He's now very famous today, but he was not very famous back then. People maintained to this airborne theory of cholera transmission for literally more than 60 years. And the Indian guys, the Indian medical service, which are British officers, they were scientifically trained and so on, were so proud of their science of the airborne theory of cholera that they rejected John Snow's theory. Right? And so for until 1900s or so, it was a complete global embarrassment because these Indian medical service people were hell-bent on showing that it was the environment. Why the environment? Because they figured out, look, cholera happens only in some parts of the year. So it can't be just waterborne, otherwise it would be affecting you all through the year, right? So there must be something to the environment. So they had their reasons. They had their own kind of scientific reasoning based on the position they were taking. But on hindsight, they were clearly wrong. Cholera is mostly a waterborne theory. Of course, there are new transmission mechanisms found today, but it is generally a waterborne disease. And it's only once they figured out transmission that people could start working out on prevention, cure, and so on. So that has to wait the truly great scientific revolution called as bacteriology. And so the great bacteriologists like Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, after everyone who gets up in the morning, drinking milk knows about pasteurization, pasteurized milk. This is all the great work of certain French, German, and a few British scientists in the late 19th century. And it's only with that you can see a dramatic divergence then in medical systems. So that's really what takes Western medicine ahead, because they start this idea of experimentation-based science. They kind of understand what is the idea of the germs creating disease and so on. And then that, of course, helps in controlling cholera eventually. But the overall progress is very slow. The case fatality rates of cholera finally fall down only in the 1910s and 1920s. And luckily for the Indian Medical Service, it's one of, our or their people who does this. And it's a guy called Leonard Rogers who finally figures out that the way to stop a body from dehydrating is rehydrating it. Right? And so what he pioneered was this IV method, intravenous method of injecting fluids, high saline sort of portions into the body, worked it out in Calcutta. It took 5 years of experimentation, but finally he got it. And that reduced case fatality rates from 50% to less than 20%. And today, of course, people say this is the greatest invention in medical history, that is ORT. oral rehydration therapy, because it's so cost effective, it's so cheap. It's just a bunch of salts in your mouth and you're ingesting it, and yet it kind of protects you against diarrhea. It protects you against an important class of diseases that historically claimed a lot of lives. So today, cholera, even if it happens, we know how to fight it, unless the strain kind of mutates and again becomes very deadly. But at least the lead time on bacterial diseases today is very good, so we can quickly fight this. But as you pointed out, 1817, very primitive, no real advantage offered by any medical system.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions, but we'll save them for after the break. Let's take a quick commercial break now. We'll be back in just a minute. Please go and rehydrate yourself, dear listener. As many of you know, I'll soon be coming out with a 4-volume anthology of the Seen and the Unseen books organized around the themes of politics, history, economics, and society and culture. These days I'm wading through over 3 million words of conversation from all my episodes so far to curate the best bits. And for this to happen, I needed transcripts. And that was made possible by a remarkable young startup called TapChief. TapChief at tapchief.com is a digital platform that allows companies to outsource work to their network of freelancers. And TapChief's network includes more than 125,000 people as of now. You want people to make you a web page or design a logo or compose a jingle or do some digital marketing for you. TapChief gives you an easy way to reach out to freelancers competing for your work. I can say from first-hand experience how valuable this has been for me and solved a problem I was actually a bit worried about. So do go over to tapchief.com and check out all that TapChief has to offer. Maybe they could solve your problem too. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Chinmay Tumbe about Age of Pandemics, his wonderful new book on 1817 to 1920 and the 3 pandemics that shaped our nation profoundly during that period, and yet we don't remember them as we should, and they hold a lot of lessons for the present day. So just a phenomenal, eye-opening book. From what you were saying just before the break, I have sort of a couple of follow-up points. One is you referred to Jon Snow, right? So, and that whole narrative is very interesting, where in 1849, he comes out with a book called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. And no one pays any attention to him. Then in 1887, you speak about MC Fennell, who comes out with, this paper called Cholera and Water in India, stop quote. And what I found fascinating about that is you've reproduced a map in the book. Like, people who've been following COVID would notice that there are all these studies of how COVID can spread through droplets in a restaurant. So you'll have maps of restaurants and where everybody is sitting and, with arrows to where the droplets are going. And MC Fennell did a similar thing where he mapped the spread of cholera in a village, and he had like 2 wells which he marked out and then showed the kind of spread proportional to the 2 wells, and therefore concluded that it's obviously a waterborne disease, which, despite what Snow had done 4 decades earlier, no one yet believed, and, advocated things like instead of these wells, we should have mass-produced hand pumps and all that. Just remarkable scientific work. And yet no one took him seriously, in much the same way that, for example, that, so many lives were lost because people ignored, Semmelweis when he spoke about the importance of hand washing and all of that. Why do you think, it seems to me that always within any establishment, in pretty much any context, even outside the context of medicine, there is this arrogance, there is this lack of humility, there is an accepted way of doing things, of thinking about things, and you imagine that this is right. And, anything new that comes up, new truths, new revelations can often take decades to spread, even in something which literally can, affect lives. So, and it's not just in medicine, it's in economics, it's in governance, in so many different fields. You find that, authorities are sticking by the wrong way of doing things for ages while, the truth is out there. So is this something that you've, kind of thought about?
Yeah, I mean, in social science, we say, paradigms go away one death at a time. It's only when the guy dies finally that his disciples, his, chelas across many PhDs, lineages who kind of propagate this guy's views throughout. But the thing with science is that this such thing should not happen. I can imagine in economics, you're a Keynesian or you're a Friedmanite, and, these kind of ideologies pass on through PhD students. But in science, the whole idea of science is fairly objective. If it's bad science, it gets figured out very quickly and it goes. So Jon Snow had kind of figured it out very well. Europe started implementing that. They started having better water supply systems. They kind of started accepting. It was controversial, but some kind of evidence-based approach to understanding cholera was on. In Germany, one of the heroes of the sanitation policy was a guy called Max von Pettenkofer. And Pettenkofer, interestingly, did not believe in the waterborne theory. And almost till his death, he committed suicide finally in the 1890s. He maintained this view that, it's the environment and not, he in fact actively looked down upon bacteriology and so on. Even Florence Nightingale had to be shown a microscope to say, look, this is the new science, right? And this is what is causing diseases. And then finally she accepted. So often you have to demonstrate, this revolutionary ideas which are coming back then. In the case of MC Fernell, very interesting, he's a lower rung sort of bureaucrat in the Indian medical service, but completely ignored by the top brass. And by some accounts, even lost his job because he was actively propagating an idea which would have saved millions of Indian lives. If people had started getting good water supply systems, that was all it was needed to prevent mass cholera outbreaks. Interestingly, the Maharaj of Travancore, wrote to him saying that, I would like to hear more about your ideas and so on. So there was a particular audience who was willing to experiment, but the IMS, Indian Medical Service, hell-bent. In fact, they looked up to Pettenkofer. They said, if Pettenkofer is saying this, we believe Pettenkofer's theory. So this is an interesting kind of thing, even in science, because both the IMS and John Snow are coming from a particular scientific tradition. But in science, we would say, one thing has to be right and one thing has to be wrong eventually. In this case, these guys held on to this position for far too long. And eventually, it was kind of demonstrated clear-cut that it was a waterborne disease. And it's only much later that these water supply systems came. In fact, in Calcutta, cholera started and overall mortality started falling majorly after 1869 when the piped water supply was introduced in the city. So even that was actually a clear-cut example of success in how one can prevent cholera. So you're absolutely right. These paradigms exist, and it's very tough sometimes for a revolutionary idea to make its way across the board. And stuff which today we would take for granted, that if this is what scientists are saying by, using a particular process of experimentation and so on, there's much more credibility today. But back in late 19th century, when the first ideas of bacteriology were coming in, it received a lot of pushback. And the people were very, very skeptical of the claims that they were making. It's only with the 1900s when, without a doubt, the ideas of Pasteur, Koch, and many others were finally holding sway.
And, another thing that kind of struck me when I was reading this book was how, we look back on those times with hindsight and the accumulated knowledge that we have and look at it through that prism. Like, I sometimes feel I cannot possibly imagine what it would be like for me to live in the 19th century, because whatever knowledge I have, I would have to assume it does not exist. I would have to strip it away. And all those sort of the certainties kind of vanish. For example, we speak about how, in one sense, the god of religion is really the god of the gaps. There are so many things you can't explain. So you bring God as an explanation. You're in prehistoric times. You don't even understand the sun, the moon, the rain, so you have gods for each of them, and so on and so forth. Now, in modern times, the only things that can't be explained is perhaps the things that will never be explained, which will never be confronted, like what is the meaning of life? And obviously one could just say that, look, rationally speaking, there is no meaning, it is random and all of that, but that's a little hard to accept. But a lot of these other questions have been answered. Like, Douglas Adams once famously said when speaking about natural selection that give me the awe of knowledge over, whatever awe religion kind of might invoke. Now, I'm kind of thinking back to the 19th century when this shit is happening all around you. People are dying and you have no clue why. Some random person is saying it's because of water, but other people are coming up with various explanations. And some of these are stunning explanations. Like, for example, you write in your book, quote, one Sanskrit scholar from that region mused that there were 3 types of disease in the world: for sins committed in past lives, for sins of the current life, and for accidental sins. And that an epidemic like cholera came under the second category, which is sins of the current life. Obviously, similarly, you talk about how there are cholera deities all over the place, including one called Harlul Lala in Bundelkhand. And at one point, one of the British dignitaries of that time who was leading them against the Marathas, in fact, in the Third Anglo-Maratha War, Francis Rawdon Hastings, you write about how his men are blamed for killing cows on Lala's grave, which is why he is effectively now taking revenge and he is a cholera deity. You also speak about how in the Konkan region on the west coast, witches and sorcerers are being blamed for cholera. And as late as 1943, B.R. Ambedkar writes, quote, "It was reported from Nasik on 1st September that the Hindus of a village attacked an Achut, which is a term Ambedkar used, attacked an Achut family, tied the hands and feet of an elderly woman, placed her on a pile of wood which was subsequently set on fire. All this because they thought she was the cause of the cholera in the village." Stop quote. And these narratives are crazy. Of course, they're not like propagating at WhatsApp speed like they do today. But, and today you could argue that despite the fact that we know so much more, these narratives are still so commonplace. Like around Sushant Singh Rajput's death when he recently dies and all the mad conspiracy theories that came up then, some on news TV and some even on Twitter and so on and so forth. And again, you've spoken about how back then people used to resist vaccination when it came about, when it, started becoming sort of popularized in the late 19th century because they were like, it'll make us important. And just today I saw on Twitter that people are talking about these current vaccines that I think somewhere in central India there is this rumor that the men start behaving like women and the women start behaving like men, which if you ask me is not a very bad thing. So there is a sense of overall bewilderment. So, and as a historian who is kind of going in there, doing the complete opposite, making sense of everything. But everybody in your stories, in the histories that you tell, most people are just completely bewildered all the time. So, what is your sense of this and, whether this kind of reveals something about the human condition and the progress of science will not affect it?
This is a very deep question because, this idea of panic, fear, conspiracy theory, rumor mongering, we've seen so much of that this year itself, in 2020. Maybe not as deadly as the rumors back then, but of course, the rumors travel much faster now than back then. For example, in March, there was this thing about Indian immunity. And a lot of people say, Ari, this will not come to India because we have such strong immunity. These people live in clean environments, and so that's why they get COVID. Whereas we kind of grow up in these bad environments, and it's almost like this pride that we can have our own water and food, and the foreigners who come here fall sick. Now, this is not something to be proud about. We have bad quality water, and we are kind of immune to it, but that's only one part of immunity. There's nothing like full blown immunity to anything. That's how we kind of fool ourselves. We fool ourselves with these nice stories, which vegetarianism, this huge thing. But Indians, there was one WhatsApp forward this year. India has never been the source of pandemics. And the subtext being, because we are mostly like the argument being because India has a lot of vegetarianism and so on. But cholera was, like the world blames China today, for nearly a century, India was seen as China is seen today, an originator of pandemics, So this sort of classic emotions of fear, rumor mongering, that will not stop. But I think here's what collective memory can do. If collective memory is there, it's a built in. We know we can see the markers and quickly react to that. So, nobody in Europe is blaming the Jews for poisoning wells. This was happening in the 14th century plague. Of course, it was happening in different ways in the early 20th century. But today, that's not happening. And so that sort of, collective memory is useful to understand. I think the thing with pandemics is that when it strikes, it happens so rarely that when it strikes, people have no clue how to react to it or any new epidemic. And that is why, building this collective memory through different generation, passing that information on to each generation is very important so that people realize that there are certain patterns. Pandemics will happen, and, there's no need to kind of completely go into panic and rumor mongering mode. One needs to trust scientists and hear out at least what they're saying, and so on. So this, and in the 19th century world, given the kind of, the world of witches and sorcerers and so on, you can just imagine the amount of crazy things. I mean, Ambedkar was reporting stuff in the 1940s, of people burning, people literally putting people on the stake, so to speak. Crazy things happening in the name of epidemics in a caste-ridden society as India, where like today the word is social distancing. Historically in India, we used to, it's a different concept, but untouchability, right? And in the world of epidemics, of course, that took on a huge meaning because often the segregation in villages and cities meant that the lowest ranking caste, for example, were confined to the worst amount of food, the worst kind of water, and highly sensitive. So influenza, for example, the death rates in plague influenza, especially influenza, was so much higher, among certain social groups of India compared to the rest. So diseases acted differently, on different sets of social groups in the population, and thus there was the thing. So if you escaped, one plausible hypothesis is that say the so-called untouchables of that time had a much, much more higher death rates because nutrition was so poor, right? So they're really poor and could not withstand these diseases. But yet, the perception that so many people who are dying of plague influenza belong to these social groups leads to a new perception that it's them who are causing these diseases. And so that becomes like a self-reinforcing stereotype. And what modern science does, of course, to kind of, tell that this is not cause and effect. There's a different set of reasons why. This is why when cholera first struck London and UK in a big way, it hit the poor parts, of this thing. And the poor actually thought that it's a way of the rich to get rid of it. So that's an interesting story.
Another of the interesting things that I found, while reading your book is that typically we think of a pandemic as an event that happened and then in a year or two it's over and it's done and all of that. But, cholera pretty much for the whole of the 19th century and even beyond, plagued us. And as I shouldn't use the term plagued us, choleraed us. And some people treat it as 6 separate pandemics. But you actually point out that, quote, the 6 pandemics should be considered as being nested within one large pandemic extending over a century. Stop quote. Tell me a bit about sort of why you come to this way of thinking about it.
Until like 15 years back, the standard way about nobody would talk about one cholera pandemic. There was always the first cholera pandemic, the second one from like 1829 to 33, the third one from 1840s, fifth one, sixth one, seventh one, and so on. And this was partly because of the way cholera was characterized by writers of those times in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when they started recording cholera as an event in history, the first writers on cholera. And all of them argued that it all started in India. And what they were trying to do is like point out each and every outbreak, say in Mexico, can be linked to it starting in India a few years before that, right? And this was a chain of events. So this idea was that every outbreak in the West happened because of some start in India and then it got transmitted by some mechanism. The problem with this theory is that oftentimes there was no clear mechanism linking it to India. So Japan, for example, it had outbreaks in many years in the 19th century, but often there's really no connection. So the connection could come from ships, from people getting off and then contaminating waters and so on. So this mystery was actually clarified only in the last 15 years, where people realized actually cholera vibrio can become endemic, which means it can sustain itself in certain water systems. So you don't need like a continuous transmission. Once it settles down in certain maritime systems, it can kind of lead to outbreaks nested from those systems themselves. So the key is, how does the 1817 strain move around the world? And so plausible hypothesis is that it moved around in the first 10 or 20 years, and then it settled down and became endemic in certain parts, and it kind of grew out from there. So in such a reading, then you don't get multiple pandemics. You're really talking about one, large pandemic, in the sense that there were outbreaks in certain times of the year, and only in certain years it could be activated, by reasons concerning the survival prospects of cholera vibrio. But beyond that, to point out each and every wave of the pandemic to India was seen to be faulty. So you now have a research paper in Japan, which basically shows that actually all those outbreaks were not linked with India, especially in the later part of the 19th century. It was more endemic. It was completely happening within. And so this new research actually is overturning earlier research which showed cholera in terms of waves of pandemics. And so there's a good one biography of cholera, again, focusing mainly on the West, which basically now makes this very strong case of not calling it 6 different pandemics, but calling it one pandemic. So I'm in a way following that line. It's really very cutting edge research of the last 10 years, which is actually showing it's shedding new light on cholera and how cholera can transmit and become endemic in certain parts. So that's the kind of line which I take in this book. That is, not all of this was linked with India. And this new strain of cholera which exists in the world today started roughly in the 1860s. And most people point out to, again, a mutation which happens roughly around Indonesia. And it's now this strain which is found across the world. Nobody talks about cholera today. It's still there, it still hurts some people because it's so easy to treat it today. So that's why it's no longer an important disease for us to kind of be worried with. But the strain mutation, the 2 big ones happened in 1817, it looks like, and one in the 1960s.
Yeah, and in fact, you speaking of Indonesia, you point out about how as it spread across Asia, 17,000 people died in what was then called Batavia, now Jakarta. And, it's spreading through East Asia, it's spreading through West Asia, where you speak of 15,000 people dying in Basra. And you also sort of talk about, and this again struck a chord of, in terms of how it must have been for a common person to watch someone in his family just die, where you write, quote, in boats and caravans and in deserts and plateaus, people watched in horror the passing of rice water stools and the subsequent deaths. Stop quote. And I guess that once, mentally you've connected the two, it must be such a feeling of terror when someone close to you gets rice water stools for the first time. Like, it's almost beyond imagination. The other sort of interesting thing that you speak about was that, look, there were four big diseases of the 19th century, as you say: cholera, plague, smallpox, typhus. And cholera actually took much fewer lives than malaria. So, and yet it dominates the popular imagination in a much greater sense. You have love in the time of cholera. You don't have love in the time of Anopheles mosquito. So why is that? Is it because the way that people it happens and they just die, and much more sort of viscerally shocking? What are the reasons behind that?
Yeah, I think it's to do the symptoms. Though I should, correct you. We do have Nana Patek's dialogue, "Ek machhar." So we do blame the mosquito at least for some reasons. But you're right. There is we don't see malaria kills so many people even today. We don't call it a pandemic. It's because it's endemic in certain regions, but there's no real clear evidence of it transmitting itself across time, like how cholera, plague, and influenza did. That's why we don't call it pandemic. Though it's far more deadly in terms of actual deaths taken. Even in this age of pandemics, we're saying 70 million people died because of these pandemics, but malaria actually killed more people. So malaria was always the number one sort of killer. So the difference between cholera and plague and some of these other epidemics is precisely the symptoms. With plague, it was this bubo, which basically got these big sort of boils on your body. And in cholera, it was these rice water stools. So there's no doubt that there's a certain kind of horror attached with cholera and plague, which did not happen with malaria. I mean, the symptoms of malaria were high fever. That is the precise. You didn't start growing stuff in your body, or you didn't have to go to the toilet a thousand times like in the case of cholera. So there's no doubt that this added to this fear of cholera throughout. And when it started transmitting, as you said, basically we see a guy suffer with this. It really became a talking point, and so it became a very quickly people started hating the whole idea of getting cholera rather than getting, say, malaria.
Yeah, and I guess, the basic symptoms of malaria like fever, shiver also happen for many other things, and therefore, you can recover from a fever, but can you recover from loose motions? This is not a question we would ask ourselves today. And among the many sort of historical consequences that you point out, the one that kind of struck me was the one about the 1857 rebellion, or the first war of independence, or whatever one calls it, and chapatis. What do chapatis have to do with cholera? Just tell me about that.
It is a debate among historians, about what did the circulation of chapatis convey. And one line of reasoning is that it conveyed the incoming of epidemics. So just to tell you the system, basically a village would send out this, let's call him a postman, postal person, and this person would give literally a box of chapatis, to the next village, and so on. And so it's like a relay network of chapatis. And it's a historical fact that this was observed in 1857, a few months before the actual outbreak began. And there's actually a research paper now which connects the dots and says that towns which got this chapati circulation basically as a proxy for impending cholera, heightened the kind of prejudice of people against the British and made them act more. So it's an interesting line of causation. But this idea of chapati circulation as an interesting traditional knowledge, you can call it, to warn others that cholera has come, cholera is in town, right? Is a very interesting and attractive proposition. But I should say that it's contentious. Not all historians agree. There are different interpretations of what chapati circulation meant. But in this book, I take this idea that it was actually connected very closely with cholera. And coming to that, 1857, such an important year in Indian history, nobody really thinks of it as cholera year, but it is a fact that cholera preceded the outbreak, and a lot of people died. More people died from cholera rather than arguably the massive uprising in that year.
No, and I know many hipsters on a gluten-free diet who would argue that chapatis are a problem in and of themselves. Now tell me a little bit about the toll of this. And also I was intrigued by something that you've pointed out when you're talking about the toll, that, you have estimated that 40 million Indians died due to cholera between 1817 and 1920, which works out to, 300,000 deaths every year, 5% of all deaths in the Indian subcontinent during this period. Now, sort of, one, you've pointed out that this is your estimate. Secondly, later when talking about influenza, which we'll also chat about, you've pointed out about how for the longest time, people believed that the figure of the number of people dead was one of the early figures that were cited at that time, which is 6 million, but actually 20 million people died. So some of the work that has gone into this is actually your original research, looking at the numbers and figuring this stuff out. So tell me a little bit about how did you do this? What was your methodology and so on and so forth?
Yeah, this is where the training in economics and also demography. The connecting theme between the first book and second book is actually demography. Demographers basically study three things: fertility, mortality, and migration. And my first book is about migration, and this book is about mortality. So the connecting theme is demography. And I've been exposed to a lot of demographic research methods. How do you estimate death with very few data points and so on? So our death statistics. In fact, this is a side note. It's precisely because of the cholera pandemic that we actually started recording deaths systematically in India. So this process starts in the early 1860s after a series of devastating cholera outbreaks in the years following that. And the British start the system mainly to monitor the health of their army. Right? So they're not really doing it for the native population. But very quickly they realize there's a need to do that. They need to sort of document systematically what's happening to the native population. So India's death registration system, like we have today, the origins of it are the 1860s. And from the 1870s, annually, province wise, sometimes even district wise, the British systematically collected deaths and the causes of deaths. Now, obviously, there are huge problems. The person who was reporting these deaths was not a well trained medical doctor. It was often the village patwari or the tax person, at the village level. So, a lot of issues around that. But the general trend that you will see kind of mimics what was happening. So in some years, if there were a lot of plague cases, you would see a spike in plague cases. So what I have on a spreadsheet now is a province level database of all the deaths between 1870 and 1940s. So that's about 70 years data. Now, that's a great database for plague, which starts in 1890s. That's a great database for influenza, which was recorded under fevers, which makes it slightly complicated. But for cholera, it's tricky because what do I do with this period 1817 to 1860s, where there's literally no database, right? So they're just guesstimates. And so on what basis does one make guesstimates? So I then look at all the records. I look at, the South Park Cemetery records. I look at different records, and there's these projections. They're not perfect numbers, but on average, there were about 300,000 people dying of cholera between the 1870s and 1910s, and that number is going up. And so what we can say for sure on the basis of that rough number, 250,000 to 300,000 deaths, is a certain number of millions of deaths of Indians. The thing with cholera, of course, was that it was partly endemic, which meant that a certain number of people died every year, irrespective if it was virulent. Right? So in Calcutta and Eastern India, where it was endemic in those maritime systems, some people always died of cholera. How do you make a distinction between what is endemic and what is epidemic? So I kind of look at only those years where clear case of epidemic, which means it spread all across India, was recorded. And so my final numbers are 8 million deaths in India in this whole period, which is epidemic, but actually 31 million people, which is endemic. Right? So there's so many more people who died in the average year itself. And so this 70 million global figure that I have in this book actually does not count the 31 million deaths of endemic cholera in India. If you add it to that 70 million, then it actually goes up to more than 100 million. So a lot of this death accounting, and it's a really morbid task, even for a person trained in statistics like me, just to, when you're looking at those numbers, just think about 300,000 deaths due to just cholera in 1 year at a time when the population of India is 1/4 of what it is today. Right? So today we are kind of unnerved by 150,000 COVID deaths on a population which is 4 times larger. So those death rates themselves are so unbelievably high back then. So a lot of this book, as I said, the starting point of this book was a statistical database to try and understand which parts of India had more mortality. And then in the case of cholera, I have this on page 70 of the book. It's probably the first time somebody is given global estimates of cholera, because it's kind of tricky. How do you estimate cholera deaths, across time? So people have done it for some individual countries. What I've just done on that table is to kind of aggregate it, again using certain methods of years for which we don't have data. But it turns out that Russia had a lot of deaths. One famous casualty being Tchaikovsky, the famous composer. Even his mother actually died of cholera. Then you have, Spain, Hungary, France, Germany, UK, all of them about a few 100,000. But Egypt, and Egypt is spectacular in terms of, I mean, the estimates that I have is, about more than 500,000 people out of a population of nearly 6 million. So that's about 10% of the population kind of getting wiped out due to just one disease, cholera. So that's kind of a really spectacular kind of strike rate of cholera in Egypt. So that's one part of this project, is to just understand who is dying and where are they dying. That's aided by British maintained colonial statistics. I should add, we actually don't know much about cholera, plague, and influenza in places where we did not record statistics. For example, the princely states in India. So we know much more about Madras Presidency, Bombay Presidency, Bengal Presidency, or UP, or United Provinces. But we don't know much about Nizam's Hyderabad. We don't know much about Mysore. We don't know much about Rajputana. And that's because these statistics were never really collected. So then need to project for them. So then, I use some other methods to kind of project for them based on basic population counts and so on.
Yeah, and lay people often think of statistics as very dry and the eyes glaze over when you look at big numbers. But numbers are people, and I guess part of the task of a skilled historian is to sort of turn those numbers into stories. And you've written about as cholera traveled across the world, how it was changing history everywhere. Like in France, you talk about how 300,000 people died, and in 1832 there was actually a rebellion out there. In Spain, you speak about how the monarch had to come out on the streets to console the people and tell them, don't worry, we are on top of it. You speak about, the religious revival in Marseille, which was Catholic at the time. And interestingly, you speak about, Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather, Dwarkanath Tagore, donating money to France. How much pride something like that would give our nationalists today. Tell me about the consequences of cholera on India. I mean, not just in terms of deaths, but politics, economics, society itself. Tell me a little bit about that, because it lasted such a long time and took so many lives, 40 million people.
Yeah, I think two very clearly discernible. One is, of course, 1857. So we should start talking more about how the pandemic was the backdrop under which the revolution took place. One is on health. There's definitely a greater demand from the people to improve public health. It's not a big demand, but that's one important aspect of how it's starting. Death registration statistics. The whole idea of tabulating death is a consequence of the pandemic. That's existing with us even today. What we call as a sample registration system. It's a 40-year history, but the real roots of recording death in India start from the 1860s, the cholera pandemic. A lot of interesting, things. Of course, some important people are killed by it. Even in 1857, some British generals are killed. There's this guy in Calcutta, a young 22-year-old guy, Henry Devorio, and he's basically sort of he dies at 22, but he's a staunch Anglo-Portuguese person who is criticizing British rule. And unfortunately, he dies at a very young age because of cholera. Raja Rammohan Roy has a very interesting thing about cholera, and this is a larger thing about epidemics. He says, obviously, epidemics are horrible because they kill a lot of people. But when you have so many people like in India, in a labor surplus kind of country, could that actually improve the lives of people who are left alive? And that's the whole reasoning between the Black Death, and it killed so many people that those who survived actually worked with more capital and productivity increased. And Raja Mohan Roy has this argument, but I couldn't find too much of reference with cholera. I found more with plague and influenza that it had positive consequences for those who survived. For cholera, not so much. It kind of, in Europe, the impact was very clear. They had cholera riots. So you had like violence attached with cholera. I mean, I write, the cholera outbreaks in Europe coincided with, Europe's Revolutionary War of 1848, the Crimean War in the 1850s, the overthrow of the German Confederation in 1866, the end of France's Second Empire in 1871, and also in Russian Poland in 1892. So important events in history which actually coincided, important political events in both European and Indian history. We talked about 1857, which coincided. The other part is that cholera coincided very much with famines. Because what would famines do is, famines also classic starvation kind of deaths. It would drive people outside in the search of water. right? Because what is a famine in India? It was basically bad lack of rainfall. And in that process, people would congregate towards certain centers where they would find water. And that is how, with contaminated water, basically cholera would, just rip through those populations. So in India's great famine years like 1899, 1900, or 1877, 78, those were the years where cholera really shot through the roof. So cholera also in interaction with famines made it much worse. And so the public health officials had to really, scamper around. The biggest implication, of course, of cholera was WHO itself. That is, it is because of cholera that you had this first conference in 1851. It is the first example of a global health surveillance system. Though, of course, it was pretty much European imperial powers plus the Ottoman Empire trying to understand how to prevent cholera. But that is really, they had a series of conferences, 1851, then another one, then 1866, series of conferences. That turns out then later, once the League of Nations is formed, it's the same set of conference people who make a kind of a department. And that is the genesis of the World Health Organization in 1948. And it's the WHO which call it a pandemic in 2020. So you can see this unbroken kind of, line connecting cholera and the first conference of 1851 and WHO announcing it, because it's all linked. It's all part of that same thing. How do we spread a disease from traveling globally?
Yeah, and what was also fascinating to me was I thought this will be like, a linear recounting in the sense that you have three chapters, cholera, plague, and influenza, but they all kind of overlap. By the time you get to say something like 1918, all these are happening. Plus, there is a monsoon that has been disastrous, and everything is just haywire. Like you speak about how the previous year there was too much rainfall, which was a problem, and the next year there is too little rainfall, and everything is just happening at the same time, along with imperialism, of course. Let's kind of move on from cholera now, as in fact, humanity is done, because it's virtually a problem that we have solved, and talk about the plague. Now, the plague's been sort of around for much longer in the consciousness. Like, I love this quote with which you started this chapter, which is from, about 1615, from Iqbal Namai Jahangiri. And I'll read it out, quote, "When it was about to break out, a mouse would rush out of its hole as if mad, and striking itself against the door and the walls of the house would expire. If immediately after this signal the occupants left the house and went away to the jungle, their lives were saved. If otherwise, the inhabitants of the whole village would be swept away by the hand of death." A stop quote, which is, the hand of death is also a striking phrase. It just, and this was written before Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. And this is also a kind of invisible hand. What a morbid thought. So tell me a bit about how sort of plague is looked at in India and how it comes to India. And in fact, plague at the end of the 1890s didn't even necessarily originate here. Like you point out, it's happening in Hong Kong, it's happening in China. Tell me a little bit about this and how it is kind of different from, cholera, which came before, and all of that.
Yeah, firstly, because, plague is history's greatest disease. If you had to put an honor on the great in terms of, there's sheer sort of glamour value attached to it in terms of what it can do and so on. Why? Because the Black Death was about the plague, right? So that was 1/3 of Europe. It was a big moment in European history. Evidence of plague attacks in Indian history, it must have happened, because we're saying plague is also endemic among rodents and so on. Again, so for those who don't know, we now know that plague is about a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, as it's called, discovered in the late 19th century. But until 1890s, nobody knew what really causes plague. And as you pointed out, all people knew was that rodents, and especially rats or mice, started dying in large numbers. And if you saw that happening, just get out. That was the sort of standard operating procedure regarding plague. I do note in the book, and I want to claim this as my little small contribution, that the Arthashastra has certain references, which seem remarkable about rats and rodents, and they also talk about rat tax and so on. And all of these things came into play in the 20th century. And I make this argument that maybe, I speculate, that maybe what the Arthashastra is referring to was the plague outbreak. This is something medical historians have not yet really latched onto. But plague has sort of always been there in the Indian subcontinent, but it never became so big we don't have evidence of it becoming so big as it did in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the fundamental way it kind of works, we now know, it comes from rodents to humans via the bite of a rat flea. But this transmission mechanism and just unraveling that mechanism itself is, one can write books on that. It is so fascinating, that whole debate. But in the 19th century, it's not that, in fact, my understanding of plague was that it comes to India out of nowhere in 1896. But even in India in the 19th century, it hits Ahmedabad in 1814, I think, early part of the 19th century. It hits Ahmedabad, and there are gruesome accounts of plague. And the thing with plague, even more than cholera. So in cholera, the bad thing is you keep going, you have to keep going to the toilet. In plague, you can see it. There are these large black lumps which develop in your body. So this is almost a bit like leprosy in the sense that this is a disease which kind of leaves its mark on its victims. Of course, there are different types of plague. There's also pneumonic plague, which is, which does not leave such marks necessarily. But the principle, the classic, plague leaves these marks and they stand out and that's why it's also recorded by travelers. And we have more evidence of plague in history than many other diseases. So it really breaks out in a big way in China. The way historians have classified is 3 pandemics. So the first one is called the Justinian plague. And new research is suggesting that it was not as big as it was previously thought. Kind of affected the Mediterranean world, so this place around, Egypt, Turkey today. And this is, we are talking about, the 6th century CE, the time of Emperor Justinian of the Byzantine Empire. Right? So that's one, the first plague pandemic as it's called. The second plague pandemic is Europe in between 1348 and 1353. But there are repeated plague outbreaks throughout Europe, until the 1700s. So London, for example, most famously was ravaged first by the plague and then by fire. And this is in 1660s or so. But plague kind of stops. It hits, I think the last time it hits Europe in a big way is Marseille, if I'm not mistaken, 1720s. But after that, it doesn't hit Europe. After that, it's pretty much China. And so that's where the accounts of plague come. It's pretty much Egypt, interestingly, and also India. And so when it breaks out in a big way in China in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, it really captures the imagination of a lot of doctors. But it becomes a global issue when it reaches Hong Kong in 1894. And that's when we kind of start saying, the third plague pandemic really begins. Because from Hong Kong, then it goes around the world. Because Hong Kong was a major trade center. It also, exported a lot of food grains. And food grains was a classic sort of storage point where rodents would go. And that is how, that's the association between food grains, rodents, and the spread of plague, which is a classic transmission mechanism. And so from China, so the most accepted theory is that it came to Bombay from Hong Kong. And from Bombay, it spread everywhere. But that doesn't mean that there was no plague before that. There was plague in Garhwal. It was called actually Mahamari. Mahamari is the word today we use for pandemic. The word epidemic, by the way, in Indian language, it's either Mari or Mari. Okay, used in different contexts for at least more than 1,000 years, I think. More of Mari in North India and more of Mari in South India. But Mahamari, which is really pandemic, in today's parlance, was used to describe plague in the Garhwal region in North India. And this is, we're talking about like 1850s and so on. This is in British reports. But 1896, it comes to Bombay. And that's when, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how the numbers are. Like you've written about how when it hit Canton in 1894, there was an 80% case mortality rate, 80%. And interestingly, people in upper stories were surviving because obviously, a little further away from rats and those pesky little rat fleas that they carry. And Canton lost 40,000 people in a day. And you've quoted this wonderful poem. Wonderful because I enjoyed reading it. It's not a wonderful, wonderful poem per se, but it's very enjoyable, called The Plague of Bombay by B.F. Patel, about Mandvi in 1896. So I will just read it out for the amusement of my listeners. Quote, I stand in Mandvi all around, with cries of woe the streets resound. This quarter crowded at the best, first falls a victim to the pest. The Jains and Bhatiyas sat to tell. First in alarming numbers fell. In every home a death or two meets a bewildered gazer's view. These sects seemed as picked out to bear alone the burden of despair. The other races as yet free could not the lurking danger see. Half callous to their neighbours' woes, the plague disturbed not their repose. But soon all undeceived they stand. The ravager with scythe in hand scours every corner of the land. Stop quote. And, apologies to all the Jains and Bhatiyas who must have, reacted with alarm when I read these words out. These are not my words. This is from The Plague of Bombay by B.F. Patel. And there's even a touch of Naimolar about this in the sense that the other races as yet free could not the lurking danger see. Now, you've pointed out that early on the numbers are not crazily alarming. Like in 1896, 3,000 people are recorded as dying, then 50,000 the next year, 100,000 the next year. Pretty bad, but not yet kind of, hysteria or pandemic levels. And most of these are in Bombay Presidency. So tell me a little bit about, what's going on with the plague in the popular consciousness at this point in time.
Yeah, the first, that's why I have a whole section called Crisis in Western India, 1896 to 98. The government of India, British India, goes bonkers, and they're doing this because they don't want plague to reach Europe. So that's the fear. They've been battling cholera all these years. They've got a grip on cholera. Cholera is no longer important in Europe. But plague invokes this memory of the Black Death, So, and again, it's the collective memory. That's what I'm, talking about in this book. It's that collective memory which is driving them to say, at no cost shall plague enter Europe. And their principal point of interest is Bombay and, of course, Hong Kong. And so they, this epidemic act which we are living under today is the creation in February 1898, where this Viceroy Elgin basically rolls out. They basically say we have to control this, and they impose these most draconian measures, which most public health experts will say is not right. Not because, for the simple reason, to combat any epidemic pandemic, you need to win the trust of people. If you don't win the trust of people, nothing can work. And so that's exactly what happened. They went around with search operations, and on hindsight, completely wrong science. They thought it was just poverty and filth which led to plague. If that was true, Calcutta, people said Calcutta got cholera because of its filth. But Calcutta rarely suffered from plague. It was really about the rats and fleas and the particular nature of rats and fleas. And this got known only after 1905 in a big way. So for the first 7 years of this pandemic, they were going on throwing disinfectants. What will disinfectants do? They're not. This is the idea again of some sort of an airborne transmission, which is still somewhere there in this medical circuits. So they went around. So the cover of the book, for example, shows a flushing, engine used to kind of use. It looks a little like a fire situation. When you think of how actually plague gets transmitted through rodents and fleas, that it's all completely wrong prevention measures. And what this meant was massive clampdown on individual liberty and huge pushback. And pushback came in interesting ways. People were scared. It hurt caste taboos, for example, like how can you touch me? So how can you inspect my wife at the railway station? So there were opposition coming from all sorts of ways. How can you how can you put me in a hospital next to a person of another caste, for example? They had these strict segregation laws. So if you got plague, you had to go to the hospital. There was no, and you would be separated from your family. And this, is important because this is the first time the British state really intervenes in Indian lives in a major, major way. And the pushback is tremendous. This is, I would say, like 1857, though we didn't have an uprising, we got certain reactions. In Pune, there was an assassination. Walter Rand was assassinated by the Sapikar brothers because they thought that this guy is breaching all limits into our society. And it's the birth of Tilak as this massive star. Tilak goes to jail. Ganpati is banned. Ganpati festival is banned. Interestingly, Ganpati, has his rodent on the side, so that's a side story of the plague. But when he's released from jail, Tilak is a star. So it's literally the plague, which launches him onto the national stage in a big way. It makes Gokhale a big star later on. Gokhale becomes, the head of Pune municipality. So it's also the birthplace. The plague is this backdrop, especially in Western India, because the British government goofs up so spectacularly that the pushback is tremendous. But the paradox is, a lot of what even I had heard of the plague, before starting on this book, was of this period, 1896 to 98. And I thought this was when plague really hit, and this was the intensity. It turns out that afterwards, actually, the British kind of said, we need to change track. We need to be having a different approach. But plague really starts hitting India after 1900. And that's when the numbers start going through the roof. And, we're talking of like in 1 year, 1 million deaths just because of plague. And it's not Bombay city. It's really places like Dharwad, Belgaum, Satara, a lot of these places in Bombay presidency, which get affected. And a lot of it was because of basically 20 years later, they realized the best way to prevent plague was rat proofing. If you could keep the rats out, you wouldn't get plague. And that is why throughout the plague pandemic, soldiers in the Indian army, very few of them died due to the plague. Why? Because they were staying in cantonments. Cantonments were nice pakka structures. You couldn't get plague in the cantonments. But you could get plague in basically, what we call as kacha structures. And that is where it had its greatest intensity. But for plague, you wanted the correct kind of rat and the correct kind of rat flea. So the distribution within India was not because certain places were more dirty than others. It just so happened that some places had particular kind of rat flea. So in South India, the rat flea was not the this X. Chiopis variety, it was a different variety. So it was not an efficient transmitter of plague from rodents to humans. So that is why South India kind of escaped plague pretty much. But in Punjab, UP, and Bombay Presidency, they had the perfect kind of rat and the perfect kind of rat flea, perfect for plague transmission. And that's why it kind of got ravaged. And that's why arguments on sanitation again fell flat because people are pointing out, for 100 years you've been telling us that Calcutta has cholera because Calcutta is dirty, and yet Calcutta kind of escaped plague. So here was the paradox, and it's only such kind of questioning which led scientists to really find out the roots of plague.
Optimal rat plus optimal rat flea. I'm going to come back to rats later because there is much about rats in the book as well. But first, this question that strikes me, and it's almost resonant in a way that when I think of current times, one of the first things that struck us in March, at least in India, is that this is a very alarming situation that is developing. And even if we don't have collective memory, at least we can see what's happening in Italy and Spain and everything and can take it as seriously as it requires. But there is limited state capacity, and therefore there is no option for a state in a country like ours but to resort to blunt tools, which in our case in India was, of course, a blunt tool of the lockdown and with its various costs and benefits. And, when I was sort of reading about what the British government did at the time of the plague, it seems that what you have is a bunch of blunt tools which also arise from a time of epistemic uncertainty, in the sense that you don't know what the hell is going on really. I mean, today we have a much better idea from the start. In fact, despite all the uncertainty about masks and, whether it is surface borne or whatever, at least we had a much better idea than those guys back then did. And I will just, I'll quote from your book about some of the blunt tools that came into force. At one point you write, quote, as part of the plague prevention measures, thousands of buildings were cleared out, citing unsanitary living conditions. Property was destroyed and burnt, and drains were regularly cleaned. Tiles were removed from the roofs of houses, and dwellings with reported infections were marked with signs outside them and treated as if they were on fire. They were flushed with water from fire engines and flushing pumps. Mixed with disinfectants such as cresol or phenyl-based potassium permanganate, houses were also lime-washed and sulfur was burnt inside. And at one point you talk about how the poor are panicking because they are often being left homeless because their dwellings have been targeted. They rise up against the government. And, one of the slogans of that time is Mar Dalo Goreko, which I don't need to translate. And in Pune, you speak about Walter Rand. Quote, Walter Rand went in for the harshest containment measures anywhere in the country, with intensive house searches conducted by European troops to identify sick people and transfer them to the hospital. In the event, accusations of forced examination and misconduct, especially with women, flew thick and fast. Rand was shot on 22nd June 1897 by brothers from an outraged family with the surname Chapekar. Stop quote. And as you pointed out, this has repercussions. Tilak becomes a superstar. Gokhale, becomes involved. Then in 1907, which is when, as you point out, 1 million people die, the Congress is sort of split between the moderates led by Gokhale and the extremists led by Tilak. And it's kind of fascinating. Again, I'm quoting you, quote, during the peak of the plague pandemic in India, more than inoculation or sanitation, it would be quarantine and evacuation that would become the norm. So in general, when you think of the state's response to events like this, and also then the pushback against the people to the state, how sort of are there patterns that emerge in terms of, overreach and so on and so forth? What are your observations?
One was, clearly a big issue while trying to enforce some sort of a lockdown then is, of course, what do we do with migrant workers? That's a big issue, of course, which happened this year, where I think, we clearly got it wrong, in my view. And we had a migration crisis earlier this year. Interestingly, the British had a very different view. They took this view that, look, whatever we do, these guys are going to go back. If we have a harsh lockdown, these guys will walk back. If we shut down the railways, they will walk back. So interestingly, for all their other faults, the British actually allowed these people to go home. Now, did that lead to a spread of the pandemic? There's no evidence of that because there's no spike in deaths, immediately after that. But what it enabled was that to Bombay, half of Bombay, 400,000 people actually left Bombay, and they came back. Just like this year, people are coming back now to the cities. But that's a classic response in a pandemic, that is return. So migrant workers will want to go back. The same voices that we heard this year were heard back then. That is, marna hai to gaon mein marenge. This psychology that if you want to die, we'll rather go back home and die. So that's one classic response, clearly, which we saw back then and what we saw today. The other, which is really interesting, is that the best strategy was actually evacuation. And this was traditional knowledge. This was passed down from generation to generation. Started off with that quote. That is, if you see these rodents coming out, spinning and dying, the best thing to do is move out. And this traditional knowledge also had many aspects to it. So entire villages would vacate and stay out during the night. There was some implied thing that there's something to do with nighttime. And later on, science actually showed that it's, a lot of this is transmitted at night. That is, these rat fleas actually really work best at night. So aspects of traditional knowledge were embedded. The British kind of, did not heed to it, and later on started respecting. So by 1905, 1910, the British realized the best strategy actually is to let villagers camp out of villages and let this season pass off of plague and then come back. That became the most cost-effective strategy. Right? In the absence of any powerful vaccine or inoculation, in the absence of any breakthrough in like a antibiotic which was not existent back then, the only thing that people could do was what people were doing for centuries. That was evacuation. And I estimate easily 30 million people must have evacuated at some point or the other in this terrible sort of decade. And I've now come across first-person accounts of people who lived on the edges of their villages. Not just villages, entire towns. Observers, there's a reference in this book, Bijapur, which is not a small place. It's got tens of thousands of people. The entire town would camp outside. So it would be a town completely locked with everyone living outside, purely in order to escape this thing. The way to beat plague was, of course, to build good buildings, good quality buildings. But there was no demand for that, and there was no supply for that. So that never really, came about. The learning from that is, massive state overreach in the first phase. The British learned from that. Eventually, the plague manual basically started off pretty much by saying respect people, and that if you have to take into people in confidence, and that has kind of persisted. All public health manuals will tell you that you have to win the trust of people. The second thing that the sort of plague did was, of course, reorganize urban governance. Now, this had its pros and cons. There were some long needed things like sort of revamping the sewerage systems, because that's where a lot of the rats were breeding. So all of that were good things, but in this process, of course, mass scale displacement, as you pointed, a lot of the poor people, had to come out on the streets. And so in those terms, huge negative repercussions. One of the consequences, of course, of plague is today, in every city, there's a development authority board. Okay, so you have like this MMRDA in Bombay or DDA, Delhi Development Authority. The roots of that lie in the plague. It's the Bombay Improvement Trust is formed as a response to the plague. The Hyderabad Improvement Trust is formed as a response to plague. And so, though our cities, I think, are, not really, the best examples of cities in the world, but whatever basic semblance of urban governance came into account was precisely because the plague prompted, things. Shivaji Park, most famously in Bombay, was created as a response to having roomy, airy flats. These are theories as to how plague transmit. And so a lot of these suburbanization, more broadly, started in a big way in India, thanks to the plague.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you referred to the guideline of how the state should treat the people. I'll read out this line that struck me from the Punjab Plague Manual in 1909. And it says, quote, "The cardinal principle of all plague administration must be that no pressure or compulsion in any shape or form is to be brought to bear on the people. Encouragement, persuasion, and the provision of facilities for carrying out the measures advocated are the only legitimate means of influencing and guiding public opinion in the direction desired." Stop quote. And, another resonant part was about sort of the quarantine circumstances. Like recently, again, just today on Twitter, I came across this sort of disturbing piece about Harsh Mandar, about he got COVID and got himself admitted to a hospital, and things were so bad that, he lost his memory for 10 days effectively, and kind of lucky to get out of there. And as he pointed out, despite all the privilege and social capital and all that, so think of what's happening to others. And, again, you can read an echo of it in the book. You've quoted from, the Shanta Gokhale translation of Lakshmibai Tilak's Smriti Chitre. So I'll read that bit out. And, this is from more than a century ago, but it need not be. Quote, the cottages were ventilated by openings about a span long running along the top and bottom of the walls. The walls were made of tin. They got so cold at night that we felt we would freeze over. We were surrounded by the sick. They screamed and beat on the tin walls. At times, a patient would climb onto a wall and jump with a loud thud into the neighboring room. The floors of the cottage had not been leveled. When you walked, pebbles bit into the soles of your feet. There was no food in our stomachs and no sleep in our eyes. Tara's her daughter. Tara's screams were heartrending. I thought if Yama had a kingdom anywhere, it had to be here. The place was terrifying. The night was terrifying. The surroundings were terrifying. And the state of my heart was terrifying. Stop quote. And, again, I thought I should read this out for the benefit of the listeners. And I'm just going to go right out and sort of buy, Smriti Chitre. And to go back to what we said earlier about people forming crazy narratives, there were all these, you've mentioned a bunch of rumors that came about, such as, the British are collecting Indian bodies to extract momai, a fluid to save themselves. This was one rumor. Another rumor was about how, for vaccination, the needle was a yard long. You died immediately after the operation. You survived the operation just 6 months and then collapsed. Men lost their virility and women became sterile. The deputy commissioner himself underwent the operation and expired half an hour afterwards in great agony. Stop quote. Unrelated question. Why does this shit spread? Like, I had Pratik Sinha of Alt News on my show, more than a year ago. And, we were discussing those crazy rumors on WhatsApp where people are talking about, children being kidnapped by strangers. And those rumors were constantly being modified with, whichever area they were meant to reach out to, that area being put in. And as a consequence, people were believing that rubbish and they were actually lynching strangers who happened to pass through their village. Now, I understand that, we are a species which explains a very complex world through simple stories. But why these kind of stories? Why this sort of morbid fascination that exists? I mean, I know that this is not related either to the book or to economics or history or whatever, but what are your thoughts on this?
I think there's something about death itself, right? I mean, death being the most natural, but also something which everyone obsess about, that really sparks off all sorts of conspiracy theories. I would say not just epidemics, even the suicide like we saw earlier this year, or there's something about death which makes it very easily pliable to gossip. I think that's really the root. Now you combine that with a general atmosphere of fear and panic, like in a pandemic, and what you get is quite a lethal sort of mix of fake information, which either this year or especially during the plague transmitted like wildfire. I think also what matters is the credibility of the state, and because the British India came down so harshly, that they kind of did not gain the trust of the people for a really long time. And so even on vaccination, later on, there's a quote in this book which says the same vaccine where people were almost causing a riot because the vaccine was introduced. Later on, there was literally a riot for the vaccine. That is, people saw the benefits of the vaccine and then wanted that vaccine. Right? So the whole mindset shifted in the span of about 25 years. But getting this idea of inoculation and vaccination took so much time, and often these doctors and so on had to literally inject themselves and show that, like what Joe Biden just did, sort of take that first shot and say that this is fine. I mean, I'm not expert on psychology, but I would imagine that under heightened situations of stress, there's definitely something to be said about the exponential rise in rumors and spread. And so that's why you need a credible state and a government which will give you good information from time to time.
The interesting thing about these kind of stories is that they don't just happen during heightened stress or, we are just surrounded by so much crazy conspiracy theory all around that it's a little bizarre. But there is also, in the middle of all this superstition and blind faith, there is also some great science happening. I was especially struck by the science around rats and cats, which simultaneously evolved during this period. Like you've spoken about how there was this municipal commissioner of Bombay, P.C.H. Snow, who charted, in your words, quote, charted the migration path of rats within the city from the east to the west and then to the north, and emphasized that rat migration and mortality impeded local efforts to contain the plague among humans in newer regions. Stop quote. So my question is, how is he charting the migration of rats?
Yeah, they're literally taking samples, they're taking samples. I mean, this is a really amazing story, this 25-year period where people are really studying rats at, multiple levels, and also cats, as I point out at one place. And what Snow is doing is, they're taking samples of rats found dead, and they're kind of literally tracking So they have these monitors of rats to see how many dead rats are we getting from different locations. And so they draw these charts and putting the number of rats found dead or even caught alive, this becomes a statistic for almost 25 years. A hotly looked up statistic during the plague years, believe it or not, is, how many rats died in your locality. And this whole phenomenon of rat catchers, becomes a big deal. So yeah, in this particular case, before the migration of humans, it actually starts by looking at the migration of rats and how they're going. And again, the science is not clear. It's even today we don't know exactly how rodents, because they can go very long distances, even just by foot. The rat fleas can't go. So there are two vectors, right? So there's a rat and there's a rat flea. The rat flea has to be embedded in the rat. But so if the rat flea can't go very far unless it's nested in, say, shirts or cotton, which is a classic, transmitter, or the rats themselves. But the rats themselves can sit in these storage and they can go by train wagons and reach, Punjab, for example, and then, infect other rats and so on. But one thing about plague, we should talk about is also that more rats died than humans. This is the thing about plague, that people, blame the rats. Yes, we blame them. But actually, it's the rats at the receiving end, and it's only when rats die that actually what happens is the flea gets hungry and then bites humans. That's the science behind plague transmission. So the unfortunate saga of, in fact, rat migration is a sign, or rat death. They're kind of helping us by pointing out that, look, stay away. There's something wrong happening. If rats are there, this is again just a joke, but if rats are there, it means that there's no plague. If rats are surviving for long periods, that means there's no plague, and you're relatively safe. But it's amazing the kind of stuff people did with rats. Eventually, the science came to be that once it was confirmed that rats were the source, rat fleas were the source, rat catching became an occupation. And even today, the Bombay municipality, I think it gives 18 rupees per rat or something like that. That's the going rate today. But this whole occupation of rat catchers took on big time, and they were given these incentives to catch rats. There were objections. For example, the Jain said, this is against our religion, so you should not touch animals and so on. So they would upset. But the mechanism is very simple. They would keep these instruments, these objects to catch rats, and they would lay these sort of poison sort of bread in these cages. And then the next day they would have to report. Now, once the rats come to the laboratory, imagine these scientists at, this plague research laboratory, they're basically studying if these rats have plague or not, because by then they discovered the germs that, lead to plague. So literally, I think there's thousands of rats landing up at this laboratory every day. Just imagine this economy, of firstly paying people to catch rats, then somebody analyzing the rats. Then they built like a rat scorecard. They have a chart, how many rats are dying and so on. And then, then they say that and because plague was cyclical, why was it cyclical? Because the rat flea could survive only in certain seasons of the year, and it transmitted. So in different parts of India, the cycle varied. But you could say that it became seasonal, which meant that people could observe, just like how we know the monsoon is coming and going. You could see over time when the plague is coming and then going, which was not known in 1897, 1898. But by 1905, 1906, it became so seasonal that this rat scorecard was very important, because the rat scorecard, as it started tapering out, you knew that plague is ebbing out. So just like we look at this COVID chart numbers, and now it's on the downward track in India. The numbers that they were seeing, even more than human beings, was actually rats.
No, and it's completely crazy because you've written a lot about this, so, I won't quote all of it, but one of the things I was struck by is how it was estimated, quote, that there were as many rats as humans in England and Wales, that is about 40 million, and using a similar ratio, 1 million rats were estimated to live in the city of Bombay, stop quote, which is just nuts. And what happens after this is, and by the way, what you were saying earlier about an incentive to catch rats, it strikes me was also an incentive to breed rats. But, was there ever a scam like that where people were breeding? There was.
There's a scam in Vietnam, for sure.
Okay. So
we don't have evidence in India, but I'm quite sure that, this economy, this is a classic perverse incentive kind of problem. But it did lead. So there's a historian who's documented this in Vietnam. It's called the Hanoi rat catchers. And, there's a whole economy which started on breeding rats so that you could, catch them. Absolutely. Yeah.
The seen and the unseen, indeed. And also the directions in which it goes. Like one of the ways to get rid of rats is to have cats. So there is a dude called Andrew Buchanan you write about who actually carries out a cat census. And then you write, quote, in 1910 he staged demonstrations in a room with glass doors of how cats killed rats to create visual awareness. His enthusiasm was supported by luminaries such as Robert Koch and S. Kitasato. However, he found few takers for his proposals in India and stringent opposition from a few scientists abroad who argued that cats themselves could harbor the plague. Some even argued that non-venomous snakes were a better option since they did not attract rat fleas. Stop quote. And I can imagine a home keeping, non-venomous snakes instead of cats for the rats. And then I found, I loved this para as well. Quote, in the middle of this fascinating mammalian and reptilian debate, cats were introduced in plague prevention policies in British-ruled Hong Kong and in German-ruled Togoland and Japan. A small business of cat rearing and trade also developed on the side. In 1909, Japan imported 4,000 cats from the USA and still noted a shortfall of 10,000 felines. Cat breeds were compared on their efficiency in killing rats. In Japan, Kitasato praised the rats sent to him by Buchanan as exquisite rat catchers and of a better race than the ones found there. Stop quote. Which is, all of it is sort of completely nuts. Now, before we move on to influenza, you speak about how the main legacy of the plague as such can be traced alongside, four kind of different arcs: law, politics, labor, and urban governance. So, can you elaborate on these for me? Because it seems to a certain extent the consequences of all of these, good or bad, are with us today.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you ask me between cholera, plague, and influenza, which had the greatest impact, which still lives with us today, it's plague. First, so the legal aspect is the law, which is called, this Epidemics Diseases Act of 1897. I mean, COVID prevention today is under that act, right? So that's the real big legal kind of. I mean, the legacy in terms of law comes from that. Interestingly, I also write about inheritance law and so on because so many people died so quickly that people had to start writing wills and so on. And it gave a little fillip to that industry as well. So that's the law part. That is the architecture of countering pandemics in India. The legal architecture was born out of this third global plague pandemic, called Plague Pandemic of India, which started from 1896. The other part is, about political movements. So one part is Tilak Gokhale, right? So that's a huge part of Western Indian politics. But then it's also about the cooperative movement, the history of the cooperative movement. So we talk about Amul today and so on. So there's some successful cooperatives. A lot of them have failed. But interestingly, a lot of that organizational bandwidth to run a successful cooperative, you need to be able to get a lot of people for your cause. So you need organizational skills, leadership skills. And that came about often in people handling these plague evacuation camps. So imagine if you have to evacuate an entire village or an entire town again and again, certain kind of cadre of people who kind of emerged in this system, who basically, were then the leaders of the first cooperatives of India, which were emerging in 1905 and so on. So the Servants of India Society of Gokhale, is a classic example of that, which were into plague relief and then became a big social work kind of society. And then, we mentioned the year of the plague, which was really 1907, 1 million deaths, the worst year in Indian history from plague, was the year of this Congress split. And so that was, it was not the defining reason. I'm not arguing that these epidemics were the main reason, but an important factor. The fact that how was the government responding to this was a big deciding point between different factions of the Indian National Congress. Right? And then in Ahmedabad, where I'm based, Vallabhbhai Patel, the Sardar Patel's starting point in politics was really being this head of the sanitation department of the Ahmedabad municipality. And his first big job was the 1917 plague outbreak in Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad kind of survived plague until then, no major outbreak. 1917, bad year for Ahmedabad. A lot of people left Ahmedabad, and Patel kind of went on the ground, tried to understand the situation. So Patel's political career also kind of starts off with this. There's an economic impact. Can't ignore the fact that economic activity is constrained. Like we know, this year is a recession year. Now think of a pandemic striking India from year to year. It's a kind of lesser known part of economic history of India that pandemics curtailed India's growth story, in the 1890s, 1910s in a huge way. And so I give examples. There are clear examples of GDP falling in some years by 5% and so on. It kind of aggravates some of these other impacts. And business houses everywhere are complaining. They're saying we can't do business in epidemic times like these. Workers get some bargaining power. And this is the classic thing of epidemics. When enough people die, the guys surviving can get good wages. And so there's a labor shortage in many sectors. which drives up wages. So that's one thing. And then urban governance, which I've already alluded to, which is these improvement trusts. So the roots of urban planning, not urban, let's say urban development, really, take us back to the plague. And so the Bombay Improvement Trust is really the first one. That starts in 1898, Mysore in 1903, Calcutta in 1911, Hyderabad. It happens literally a few months after Hyderabad is knocked out. And you cannot talk about the urban history of India because so many cities of India, plague was a huge part of their history for at least 20 years. And Hyderabad, between 1911 and 1920s or so, was continuously ravaged by plague. Hyderabad's population collapsed completely. We talk of the Musi floods, in Hyderabad, which for Hyderabadis people know about the Musi floods, but actually the plague killed many more people than the Musi floods. But nobody remembers the plague as we do the Musi floods. And that's again coming back to this point that floods, earthquakes, big calamities, war are better remembered than epidemics because epidemics are not destroying, capital stock and so on. So this is how I see the legacy of the plague on politics. It's interesting. If you see the full arc of Indian freedom movement, the way I'm looking at it now is cholera and 1857 uprising, plague and the rise of the Congress, and influenza and the rise of Gandhi. Right. So three major sort of markers in our freedom movement can be pinned against the backdrop of a major pandemic.
And Mahatma Gandhi also kind of plays a side role even in plague hitting South Africa, because as you point out, when he's in South Africa, that sort of slogan of his, cleanliness is next only to godliness, perhaps has something to do with that. And you also talk about how because white South Africans would blame outsiders for this, in a sense it was also a contributing factor to apartheid.
Yeah, so that's definitely the case. We've talked so far about plague in India, but plague, when we say it's a pandemic, it really reached many parts of the world. It didn't kill many people. The estimates I've put until 1920, 13 million deaths, 12 million in India. But there were 1 million deaths outside India, a lot of it in China. But South Africa got hit. Brazil got a little bit of plague, not too many deaths, but a huge scare. Some parts of Europe, Indonesia got a lot of plague. And in South Africa, there's no doubt that, it contributed. It's not the main factor, but it contributed towards these very strict segregation policies that started. Because like with cholera, plague was associated with filth and dirt. So how do we keep plague away from us? Don't let these people who carry plague come near us. And so segregation policies were, very strongly put into place in South Africa. So as a historian has noted on plague, Myron Eschenberg, who's written a book on plague poets, he says it contributed to the rise of nationalism in India, the Great Fire in Honolulu, which is, in Hawaii, the persistence of anti-Asian prejudice in the US. So though it didn't hit the US, their immigration laws became extremely racist after 1905, precisely because they associated with immigration the disease. Right? And so that's how this anti-China, anti-Indian sentiments rose. The rise of apartheid in South Africa and the growth of public health service in Brazil. Interestingly, in Brazil, one of the leading scientists in the world, was appointed at a very young age to be their public health expert. And he did a great job. He created, people say he's a kind of, the pioneer of public health in Brazil. And I'm pointing this out because Brazil today is on, one spectrum with the government of Brazil is on this literally an anti-science spectrum. If you plot the governments of the world today, Brazil is on one end where the president of Brazil continuously says, that this is not even a virus, this can't do any harm, and taking blatantly sort of anti-scientific positions. And more than 100 years back, it was the Brazilian government who got in the best scientists possible to handle the outbreak. It just shows you, how things have changed for Brazil over that 100-year period.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move on to talking about influenza now, where, the way it strikes seems to be like much more dramatic. Like you have a quote at the start of your chapter from the famous preliminary report on the influenza pandemic of 1918 in India, which is a report from which that 6 million figure comes, as you point out later. And this quote goes, quote, "The hospitals were choked so that it was impossible to remove the dead quickly enough to make room for the dying. The streets and lanes of the cities were littered with dead and dying people. The postal and telegraph services were completely disorganized. The train service continued, but at all the principal stations, dead and dying people were being removed from the trains. The burning ghats and burial grounds were literally swamped with corpses, while an even greater number awaited removal. The depleted medical service itself, sorely stricken by the epidemic, was incapable of dealing with more than just a minute fraction of the sickness requiring attention. Nearly every household was lamenting a death, and everywhere terror and confusion reigned. Stop quote. And a stark picture, and also for if any of my writing students are listening to this, an excellent use of semicolons. Like, they work much better than full stops here in terms of the accumulation of effects and the impact that they have on you. And while these are sort of general and abstract, the writer Suryakant Tripathi, also known as Nirala, wrote about how, quote, my family disappeared in the blink of an eye. In whichever direction I turned, I saw darkness. Stop quotes. So tell me a little bit about influenza, how people react to it. What are the theories at the time that, hey, what is causing this? Which, as you point out, till 8 decades we didn't know for sure what was causing it. So what was that like? Because by now this is no longer like cholera, which is spreading slowly in a country where the railways aren't there and all of that. This is just sweeping through populations. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yes, so firstly, because this idea of flu, most people think of it as a cold, right? I mean, the common cold is also part of this, what they call as rhinoviruses, as they're called. But the flu comes from influenza. Had people heard of influenza in 1918? Yes, because there was something called as the 1890 influenza pandemic. So the 1918 was not the first one. In fact, historians kind of note down many pandemics, but they were not as lethal as the 1918 one. And in Indian medical circles, they were aware of what had happened in 1890. And it was called Nai Sardi Bukhar. So when it had first come, it said that it was Nai Sardi Bukhar. So the difference between influenza and the other two diseases, cholera and plague, is that it's not as glamorous. And that's because you don't have to go to the toilet, or you don't have to. Nothing, boils don't come on your body. You just get a fever and some chills and so on. The reigning medical knowledge at that time was bacteriology. In fact, virology was not even nobody knew about what are viruses and so on. And so people thought that influenza is called by something called as Pfeiffer's bacillus, Pfeiffer being a name of a scientist and bacillus being bacteria. And this was 1893, I think, is when he kind of noted this. And so 1918, the medical establishment thought that this is just another strain of Pfeiffer's bacillus. And so all the vaccination efforts, which did take place, but they're completely futile, was on the basis of thinking that the flu is nothing but bacteria. So they got that quite wrong, in the sense, it's like saying coronavirus today is not actually a virus. 50 years later, somebody says that it's actually not a virus, it was something else. So that's what people were working with, the premise that it was bacteria, but it was not, it was a virus. So that was one big unknown, right? And that's why nobody really knew how to deal with this. 1918 influenza, the virulence was kind of unprecedented. Most people would say it has never happened since then also. It spread so quickly around the world. It reached villages in remote Alaska. It reached islands in Pacific Ocean. Just some human contact was enough, but you required human contact. And that is why the scientist, Fred Hoyle, who's a famous astrophysicist, he in fact pointed out that how can it be so virulent? So he argued much later, many decades later, that this had to do with some sort of a meteoric dispersion, that some meteor was coming from outer space, and think of it dispersing the virus, or and that by then they knew it was a virus, across the world, right? But we have evidence of influenza not touching certain islands of the world, and it's precisely where no ships landed there, right? So it's precisely in those islands which said we are not going to take any ships coming in, which got that early warning notice, which completely escaped influenza. So there were literally a few parts of the world which were without influenza at all. It was not only virulent, it was lethal, right? And so case fatality rates varied around the world. In India, it was unusually high, but typically in the range of 3 to 5%, which is very high combined with that virulence. And it devastated 500,000 deaths in the US back then, literally hundreds of thousands of deaths in Europe. The context is also important. It came during World War One, right? And it eventually killed many more people than the war itself. So the war ends in November 1918, but the bulk of the influenza deaths happened between September 1918, let's say August 1918, and December 19. So this is really a pandemic which lasts for 3 months, though most people today classify that from 1918 to 1920. And that's why this book's title also takes 1920 as the end. But most of the deaths happened in a 2 or 3 month window, that is September, October, November of 1918. Where did it start? It's still a mystery. Most people would call it, would say America and Kansas. That's what the reigning theory suggests. But it's famously called as the Spanish flu. Nothing to do with Spain. It's just the fact that Spain happened to be neutral in World War One, and so it had its press was reporting about the disease, and so more people heard about the flu in Spain, and that's how it earned the word. I mean, it's a complete misnomer. Spanish. It should actually be called the American flu if you want to call it, a particular name. It's more accurate to call it an American flu. But we now know it as the Spanish flu. And of course, one should not. I call it the influenza of 1918. I don't think we should be giving geographic descriptors to diseases. It comes to India and it's in two waves. Okay, it comes in two waves. The first wave is mild. The second wave is devastating. And interestingly, it kills off people in the working age group. So unlike COVID, which is high mortality among the old people, or even plague, which also killed a lot of infants apart from working age people, influenza had this unique W-shaped signature. It killed off a lot of very young people. Then its mortality impact was lesser in the 10 to 20 age group. 20 to 40 age group, it really spiked up. Then it kind of went down. So if you see its mortality across age groups, it was W-shaped. And that's the signature of the virus because that W shape was observed around the world. Right? So a lot of theory as to why, scientific theory as to why it happened. And what did it do? It really attacked your lungs. So influenza was also directly linked with pneumonia. Right. So in a sense, it attacked and then, the kind of pneumonia took over and kind of destroyed your body. And so literally people's lungs would fill up with fluids. One way to think about influenza and death is your lungs completely giving way. Right? And so many of these deaths, eventually people had turned blue and so on, like cholera, but for a different reason. So that's the ghastly nature of influenza. At the end of the day, it's a flu, and even flus are not supposed to be so lethal. But this particular strain was. And we can talk about why it was so devastating in India and so on. But the mortality estimates at that time globally were placed at about 20 million. That number has been revised upwards and only upwards since then. And I would say the best estimates put it at about 40 million worldwide. We still don't know the exact numbers for China in terms of mortality. So that's a big blind spot. But there's some papers which say 50 million plus, and so on. I think there's only one paper recently which is pulling down the number, but 40 million is the go-to number now. Global deaths due to influenza pandemic. And I argue in this book, I've taken up the estimate for India in a way back to 20 million. Kingsley Davis was a demographer. He had kind of back of the envelope calculation. He said 20 million in 1951. Then that number was brought down. So in 1918, when this report came out called the preliminary report, the number, Norman White, the health commissioner of that time gave was 5 to 6 million. This was only British India, so not princely states. Okay, so if you added, say, 1 million to that, you'd get maybe 7 million. It's really the census of India. When they enumerated the census in 1921, that really the enormity of loss stood out because the census officials said, look, it was not 5 to 6 million because that is not the number we're getting. Because when they went to the villages, they found villages just decimated. So it's interesting that it's about 2 or 3 years after the event that actually the enormity of loss came in. Because remember, how do you even get this information on loss? You have to have a newspaper system. You need to have news agencies. The point is, even those guys died. So even reporters died. So it was not really covered as an event. It got covered only when the census officials went and said how many guys are there in the village, and you compare it to the previous census, and then you find this staggering gap. Right? And so how do you explain this gap? Is it because of influenza or plague or other reasons? So there's certain methods to discern this, but there's no doubt that the influenza had huge impact. And so the estimates range between, I would say, 14 million. Siddharth Chandra has an estimate of 14 to 15 million. And I basically put it upwards more because I have found that actually mortality was much higher in Hyderabad state and Rajasthan. And that has never been accounted for till now. So this is my research claiming higher mortality for these states. And so now the number is about 20 million for India. So these are my estimates for the mortality.
And what is absolutely nuts about all of this is, we are thinking of 2020 as this horrendous year. It's almost a meme that somebody dies and, people will tweet, oh no, 2020, when will it get over? But, 1917 and 1918 were almost like a perfect storm of horrendous events. Like, as you've pointed out in the book, a quote, India went from being abnormally wet in 1917, suitable conditions from malaria and plague, to being abnormally dry in 1918, a classic condition for famine. So you've got malaria, you've got plague, you've got famine, you've got influenza hitting and killing 20 million people. Plus you have all the political discontent, the Rowlatt Act, Jallianwala Bagh. It's all kind of going to hell. I mean, and in a sense, it's therefore, not that surprising that, with all those glamorous events happening, the influenzas kind of been sort of overlooked. And I'll come back to that. I was also struck by one thing here. Like one, of course, the common theme in all these pandemics, including the current one, is the essential state failure. Like you quote the historian Mridula Ramanna as saying, quote, confusion and inconsistency seem to have marked the response of the authorities throughout the presidency. But what was heartening then, and is similar now in a sense, is the response of civil society. Like you write about how, quote, there were appeals in newspapers to send people from voluntary service organizations in Bombay city to affected rural areas. These organizations would emerge as the saving grace of the pandemic across India. And then later you write, quote, in Bombay city, the organizations aiding in this effort were an eclectic mix of the Hindu Medical Association, the Social Service League led by N.M. Joshi and its Influenza Relief Committee, community-based hospitals for the Jains, Lohanas, Marwaris, Bohras and Parsis, St. George's Nursing Association, Young Men's Mohammedan Association, Bombay Humanitarian League, Telugu Free Library, Japanese and Shanghai Peace Goods Association, and dozens of others. They distributed food, medicines, and often ran traveling dispensaries, stop quote. Almost like, a secular uprising of the people helping each other in times of need when the state has failed. Somewhat similar to what even happened here during the migrant crisis or during the lockdown in general, where it was civil service groups in Delhi and in Mumbai who fed so many thousands of people and helped them out and helped them get home and all of that. What's your take on sort of this aspect of what was going on? And, is it something that we only notice during a pandemic, that only comes up in these times of emergency, and otherwise we chill out and most of us, we are like, hey, the government is there to do all this. It's not my work. But suddenly when there's a major sort of tragedy like this and you realize the state can't handle it, then you go out and get the job done yourself.
Yeah, I think, it's a big question. I think state failure is obviously an obvious prompt for civil society to wake up. But I think there are many aspects of state failure where civil society does not respond to. But pandemics, as you rightly point out, precisely because it affects all of us collectively, and we're all in it together. That is what kind of gets it, much more prominence. And so, like you said, like this year, 1918 was unprecedented in the amount of outpouring. I mean, literally everyone was in it to help others. Because you could see, I mean, if you want to think of like some of these zombie movies of people walking around, dead people walking, or people falling off dead, something like that. I mean, when you say 20 million people dying in a few months, this is literally like that, first quotes of the book of this chapter says, people literally getting off railway stations and their dead bodies around. Literally people dying on the streets, it's that horrific. And so there are two possible responses. People go back into their houses and say, I'm not going to come out, or actually basically try and help others in certain ways. So the Mysore government, for example, they started these dispensaries. They would have this unique medical system. The doctors would go to houses, take a note of what are you eating, what is your diet, and they had some basic prescription. Because what they realized was with some amount of nutrition, you could sail through it. Right? So as long as you're well nourished, you could get through the flu. But if you were not that well nourished, the mortality rates were just an absolute killer. So that's the kind of realization that people found out. And what it meant was that you could then, as an individual, cut down mortality, not based on science, but just based on a reasoning that when you saw hatta katta person get the influenza, it caused some pain, but the person didn't die, right? But when the person was not that well nourished, the person was dying. And that sort of idea that we need to get basic food and water out there, a massive response. And so the public health commissioner, a guy called Norman White, as I say, he would later sarcastically quip that the outpouring of support in large numbers from the educated towards the poor in times of distress was unprecedented perhaps in the history of India. I mean, he uses his words to say that this was an interesting episode where the rich actually cared for the poor, right? It was truly a remarkable effort. Was it successful? All we can say is that it must have prevented millions of more deaths. So it must have helped stop it. It was really herd immunity which kind of stopped it eventually, right? In the sense, it just ripped through the population, and it's still a bit of a mystery as to how it goes out. Maybe it mutates to lesser forms, or was it complete herd immunity? But whatever it is, the loss was just immense. And as Alfred Crosby, the historian, says, the single largest demographic shock ever received to the human species. So when we say 40 million people dying in a few months globally, and in that India being 20 million, this was a shock of like no other. There's an oral history. Dr. Yogesh Kolkande, who I cite in the book, who was on COVID duty this year, he asked in his village in Vidarbha region, rural Vidarbha, saying, are there instances of this in the past? And interestingly, the memory lingered on, of influenza. And this particular tribal leader from the Adivasi leader from the Gond tribe stepped up and said, my father in our family, they tell us the story of a time when so many people died that a person had to be given alcohol to drive the bullock cart to dispose of all the bodies. And just the sight of bodies stacking up is one of the defining images of influenza in this time. Nirala talks about the Ganga being stacked with corpses, oral histories pointing out to bodies being thrown off the cliff. Really staggering number of deaths, which took place out here. And one of the reasons, the sub stories of this is that it kind of came on the back of a drought, and so that was an important part of the story, that the drought had led to a lot of undernutrition, which kind of influence acted upon.
And there's also sort of an unintended consequences or an unseen effect, as it were, where at one point you write, and this is from bodies piling up, and at one point you write, quote, in the hilly areas of Kumaon, corpses were thrown into the jungle, and according to the writer Jim Corbett, led to leopards developing a taste for human flesh and thus being labeled man-eaters, stop quote. And to think that we blame leopards and pass judgment on them, and, it's not their fault. What are they to do? A similar unintended consequences that, you point out how Godrej Godrej was founded in 1897 to make security equipment, and in 1918 they moved to manufacturing washing soap bars, which is a classic example of incentives. Let's kind of now, before we move on to our final section, and we'll keep it brief because I know I've held you long enough, let's move on to sort of the aftermath and the consequences of, the influenza pandemic over here, because as you point out, it's not just the death toll. At one point you say it is possible that in 1918, 40 to 60% of the Indian population contracted the flu. This has consequences even on those who survive. You estimate that the GDP that year, went down by 10%. And all kinds of things are happening because more women than men are dying. The birth rates also go down, and all kinds of shit is playing out over the long term. There's a supply side shock. When it comes to labor supply, there's a demographic impact. All of these things are happening. So tell me a bit about what these kind of impacts of that particular pandemic were.
Yeah, I mean, the economic loss was massive. Yeah, partly because of the drought, but also because simply this is the classic supply side shock, as economists would call it. That simply there are no people, and hence there's no production. And so we say the GDP fell by about 10%. It's in fact instructive, right, that in India's recorded macroeconomic history from 1901 to now, the 2 years in which India saw a negative 10% kind of fall were both pandemic years, right? And that's why I feel, economic students who often know a lot about what the Great Depression did to the US economy should be taught in India about what pandemics can do to your economy, because they've had such a big importance in Indian history. Agricultural yields fell that particular year. The big impact was on labor, and what a big argument I make in this book is that influenza gave birth to India's labor movement in a big way, right? And I show this using, the spike in articles on, like if you look at the Times of India database, the number of times the word unions or labor is kind of mentioned spikes up dramatically after influenza. And there are tons of documents from the Royal Labour Commission, a variety of sources, which tell you it's that particular 3 months which changed the game for labor. Simply because if you don't have 20 million people, what are, people who are going to employ these people? They get tremendous. So the guys who were left behind get tremendous bargaining power. And so wage rates start going up. So some amount of labor, the conditions of labor tend to improve. But more importantly, for the freedom movement, these guys now see, of course, influenza as a rallying point, you see so many people dying. It's very clear that the British are not these so-called benevolent rulers. There's this massive calamity which has happened, and there's a lot of opposition to the British that's coming out of this. And then, of course, stuff like Jallianwala Bagh tragedy and so on. So that's, a huge part of the story. The idea that public health, I mean, it was, the leading official in health, Norman White at that time, they were called the Sanitary Commissioners of India. And it's after influenza that they called the Public Health Commissioners of India. So the word public health itself comes into a consciousness really thanks to influenza. And there's some improvement, not much improvement, but there's some improvement in the uptake of medical colleges because people realize that wherever there was some amount of medical facilities offered, people could survive the flu. And so one obvious, counterpoint was that if you increase medical facilities, then it would be good. It did not get so much international opinion or criticism like the Bengal famine, for example, much later. But the Americans, I mentioned there's even in the American politics, people are pointing out to what's happening in India, saying how can so many people be allowed to die at that point. So emphasis on public health slowly sort of improves. The labor movement starts off in a big way. Again, like the cooperative movement and plague, the cooperative movement also starts rising. But the biggest impact is that the death rate of India finally starts falling. And that's why influenza bookends India's, you can say, millennia worth of mass mortality. And 1920 is when the death rate starts falling. And that's two reasons. One is all three, cholera, plague, and influenza start ebbing, because there's better understanding of cholera and plague, and influenza is kind of a one-off. But influenza kills off so many people who would have otherwise died of cholera and plague in the next years, right? So in a strange way, it kind of knocks out so many people. So the people who are left there then kind of are surviving or living for longer time periods. So India's demographic transition begins at the end of influenza. Why? Because once death rates start falling, over time, birth rates start falling, and that's when India's population growth really starts to grow. So, how we became 1 billion people, I mean, throughout history, we had high death rates and high birth rates. And our population fluctuated between, most estimates between 100 and 200 million people. It's only after influenza that actually death rates started falling substantially. And the Indian population started growing steadily, from 300 to 400 to 500. And today we are, 1.2 billion people. So India's falling death rates, really that journey starts off from the end of influenza. And so that's why it marks the end of an epoch of mass mortality.
I like the way you point out that if they hadn't died of influenza, they would have died of cholera or the plague. If one guy doesn't get you, the other guy will. So where you going to run? So we are indeed, those of us who are still here in 2020, so incredibly fortunate that we just have, two enemies to contend with, two dangers to ourselves. One is COVID-19 and the other is the flailing state. Now, my next question is sort of, you have a chapter at the end where you look at COVID through the rearview mirror. You look at the lessons of the past for COVID. And one of the things that you point out is about the incentives of politicians, about how what we see nowadays is that politicians actually have an incentive to downplay pandemic deaths. And they can do this by underreporting them, or they can, file something under pneumonia, or they could simply not test. In fact, Donald Trump famously said that one way of getting the COVID numbers down is, test a little bit less. And the logic there is, of course, impeccable, except that he was making it explicit. And these incentives work on all politicians. So one, there is this, because I think one of the truths that modern politicians have figured out that to a large extent governance doesn't matter, narratives do. I mean, obviously, if you go to the extreme, then governance will also matter if people are dying in the streets. But otherwise, it is really the narratives that matter. And your incentive is towards, looking after the narrative and not actually doing anything about the problem. Quite often, it will come from denying the problem. And another aspect of this is in the tail end risk. For example, you point out that, all of these things are foreseeable. Bill Gates famously said, 5 years ago that the next pandemic is going to be vicious. And it seems to me that a politician's incentive will always be to downplay the tail risk because your bandwidth is limited. There are only so many things you can do and talk about. So if something is an extremely low probability event with extremely high costs, despite the high costs, the probability is so low that you're best off ignoring it. And when people do talk about, tail risks, such as, every time there is the warning of a pandemic which doesn't quite become a pandemic like bird flu or swine flu or whatever, then, it seems like what was a fuss all about, and wasn't that a false alarm? So how does one then think about the incentives of politicians? Like, I completely get your point that collective memory is important. That is, in fact, what helped, Southeast Asia deal with this current pandemic, because they've been through those previous scares and they kind of got their act together. Kerala dealt with Nipah, which is why they were a little more efficient here. But having said all of that, it's also true that, the incentives of politicians are in a different direction, and so on. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think, politicians have to claim, that they're doing a good job. That's the basic objective of every politician, whether it's Trump or, any politician, going to try and sell this idea that we're doing a great job. Now, can we objectively say that somebody is doing a great job? What I say in the book is actually no. What we can objectively say if somebody is not doing a great job, it's asymmetric in the sense that if, Pakistan has very few deaths and, the economy is not tanked as much as in India, does that mean Pakistan has managed it much better? I don't know, right? But I can definitely say that US has managed it badly because they've got, deaths per capita is very high on the global spectrum and so on. So the way I'm looking at this is, don't celebrate people like New Zealand is the classic poster child right now of good pandemic management. I would say don't do that. I don't think New Zealand has done a great or bad job. All we can say is that some countries have messed up big time, and US is probably the classic case of that. India is, not really. If you look at any objective measure, it's not that bad. But in our neighborhood, we are the worst. That we can say for sure. So the politics of pandemics is, first is how much to intervene. That's the big question. How much should we lock down? And the decision we took, for example, was on this probability that, suppose it goes out of hand, then the loss will be too much for us. Now, on hindsight, of course, maybe some would say it was too harsh. It was definitely not well thought out because we got a migration crisis, unnecessary out of it. But I think this tension between economics and epidemiology, which was also there in this age of pandemics, kind of replayed very classically this year. Interestingly, there's already a research study which shows countries which are closer to elections, did not intervene that much. Right? So US had an election this year and they did not do much. Why? Because the economic losses are so massive, right, that it will basically hurt your electoral prospects. So that's one theory. That is, countries which were closer to elections actually did not intervene that much. So that's one way to look at it. On a more grand scale, of course, between the last age and this age of pandemics, that time they were imperial powers, and Britain did not really invest as much in public health to control cholera in India vis-a-vis with what they were doing in Britain. So obviously democracies help. So that's the working hypothesis, that democracies are going to be better off at understanding pandemics because the information base will hopefully be more timely and so on. In any case, the death reporting hopefully is much better. Like today, if you ask me how many people died of COVID in China, I don't know what is the number. There's a stated number, but nobody really knows what is the actual number, or in Iran. But you can be quite sure of the numbers in the US, in many of these other countries. And so that's one thing that democracy really gives well. The other thing about pandemics, as I said, is about the regional variation of deaths. And we saw that very starkly in India. Every now and then, so Kerala was this model. Then even today, Kerala is leading on the most indicators of COVID deaths and so on. But it's changed, from what Kerala was 6 months back to now. Things have slightly changed in the pecking order. And what pandemic history tells you is that this will happen. At some point, some regions will have more deaths, some other regions will have more. There'll be some reasons which science will tell us, 5 years down the line as to why COVID mortality was much higher in some parts of the world than others. And so what the kind of inference I'm taking as starting off with is that good pandemic management, the state has an important role to play, but there are a variety of other factors, right, including the disease, etiology and so on. Just like why, plague hit Bombay and Punjab, but not so much eastern and southern India. It didn't really have much to do. It had more to do with the nature of the rats and fleas. And so there is this role of the disease itself, the unique characteristics of the disease itself, and the impact it's having. And politicians, of course, will always try and, as I say, compare losses with somebody doing worse than them, right? And so that's why in India we're comparing ourselves with US. If we compare ourselves with other countries in South Asia, we are the worst off. So this sort of who are you comparing against is every politician's sort of choice to make.
Yeah, and one of the heartening things at least is how far the science has progressed, and not in an incremental way, but almost exponentially, in the sense that, when influenza hit in 1918, people promised that there'll be a vaccine soon, and they only started work on a vaccine in the 1940s. And regardless, while they found vaccines for other kinds of the flu, there's never been a vaccine for the coronavirus before this. I remember, epidemiologists saying this year that there may never be a vaccine for COVID-19 because while, there have been other flu vaccines, nothing for a coronavirus. Look how long the HIV vaccine has been in the making. Yet here we are. And this is like so incredibly remarkable. Now that your book is out, and now that we've kind of discussed some of the lessons in terms of governance and the way people react and the importance of collective memory and all that, but the other factor in this is, of course, the science, which is advancing massively. But, nevertheless, it could be said that, viruses and bacteria have always kind of had the upper hand against us, if not colonized us entirely in a much deeper way than the British could manage. So when you kind of look at the future, when the next pandemic comes, will we have learned the lessons of this one? Is there a sort of given everybody's incentives and the imperatives? Is there a classic road it'll go down on? Like at one point you talk about the stages of a pandemic, and the way you have classified it is between denial, confusion, acceptance, and erasure, which I found quite enlightening in light of all that you write in the book and in light of all that sort of happened in this year. So do you think that we'll at some point, learn from the past and nail the correct response to something like this?
I think it's possible. As I say, pandemics cannot be eradicated, but pandemics can be curtailed. And that is all that you can do. I mean, there will be epidemic outbreaks in the future, but it's about how you respond to it. And I think first, obviously, trust science and trust what the scientists are saying. But I think what this pandemic has also shown that this classic recommendation of a lockdown, while obviously very useful, in a country like India has massive social costs because the impact of a lockdown varies across different occupational groups. Those who can't work from home, simply put, are simply getting poorer by the day. And so hopefully some of these learnings, so having a good social security net for people who are going to lose out, in this place. Like, for example, the migration crisis was completely anticipable, at least for those who study migration. Hopefully, when the next pandemic comes, we don't have a migration crisis. I think that's the learning, that can happen. And that's what past pandemics tell you. That is, you have to anticipate migration. So you either ensure that there's enough social security given so that people are not thinking of going back, or you allow them to go back first up and then do the lockdown. It's one of these two, but you can't do neither of them, as we saw earlier this year. So there are lessons to take from this pandemic into the next. There are lessons to take from past pandemics. And as I said, the lesser we erase, the more likely or the less likely we are going to deny when it next comes. So these four stages of denial, confusion, acceptance, and erasure. And if we don't erase the memory, then we are less likely to deny, and we are more likely to move on to that acceptance phase in a way of smart science. That is, you look at the best technologies available to combat a pandemic and then move on. So clearly, I mean, I'm convinced that there's a role to kind of memorialize certain events, especially in the medical community, which is the front runner to kind of contain a pandemic. So, one of the things I'm getting from the medical community is that if only they had known about this migrant world, for example, then some of the recommendations would not, because the guys who recommended our government in March were almost all doctors, which is good, right? But nobody had really thought about migrants, right? And this is a complete sort of blind spot, which seems to have been there. So hopefully, I hope there are many books written on COVID and different angles of COVID. I think learn a lot about nurses and doctors and how people actually live, especially the lives of frontline workers, which I think needs to be documented. There should be awards for people doing great work. Uh, we've had 150,000 deaths due to COVID, but in the past, mortuary workers, when you think of millions of deaths, literally, just imagine people burying these people or burning the bodies. So many people involved in the pandemic, and we need to start recognizing the labor and value, of that work, so that in the future, it's going to happen, but hopefully we kind of sail through the next one comfortably.
On these words of hope, I think we might as well sort of end the episode here. Chinmay, thanks so much for giving me so much of your time and giving so much of time to writing these wonderful books, both this one and India Moving, which I think are just remarkable books which anyone interested in India or pandemics, in the case of this latest one, should certainly pick up. Thanks, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up Age of Pandemics by Chinmay Tumbe. You can follow Chinmay on Twitter at Chinmay Tumbe. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Stay safe, and thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.